The good news? Charles II of Spain was born. The bad news? Everything else. It was November 6th, 1661, in Madrid. The air smelled of incense, politics, and just a hint of regret. As royal bells rang out to announce the birth of the new heir to the Spanish throne, courtiers held their breath. The Spanish Empire was faltering. Its treasury was leaking gold like a broken chalice. And now, finally, a new Habsburg boy had arrived to save the day. Spoiler, he didn't. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with his family tree. If most people's ancestry looks like a branching oak, Charles's was more like a snake that got confused and started eating its own tail. The Habsburgs had been marrying each other for generations. Cousins, uncles, nieces, and the occasional sibling thrown in for spice. Why? Because nothing says power consolidation like marrying your aunt and pretending that's normal. As a result, Charles had less genetic diversity than a slice of white bread in a snowstorm. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had married his own niece, Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria. That made Charles not just their son, but also their nephew, cousin, and walking cautionary tale. One historian once described the Habsburgs as a family that had married itself into extinction, and Charles was exhibit A, B, and C. Physically, the poor boy came into the world looking like someone had assembled a royal baby from spare parts they found in the wrong gene pool. He suffered from a dramatically elongated jaw, now infamous as the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible so pronounced that he couldn't chew properly, and drooled constantly. He had trouble closing his mouth. His tongue was oversized, making speech nearly impossible. Imagine being born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, but struggling to pronounce your own name. Even worse, Charles's body was a medieval medical mystery. His bones were soft, his limbs were weak, and he couldn't walk until he was about four. While other royal children were riding ponies and being lectured in Latin by age 5, Charles was still being carried around like an oversized porcelain doll with a sad haircut. His cognitive development was no better. While most kings were taught statesmanship, Charles was still struggling with basic conversation. A court observer once noted that his mind is as weak as his body, which is a polite 17th century way of saying, the lights are on, but no one's home. Naturally, the doctors were baffled. But that didn't stop them from giving confidently wrong diagnoses and performing questionably helpful treatments. At his birth, the royal physicians huddled together like medieval mechanics, staring at a carriage missing several wheels. Their conclusion? Well, he's alive. Sort of, which, for a Habsburg, was honestly a win. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. People began to wonder. Maybe it wasn't just inbreeding. Maybe there was something darker at play. Maybe Charles had been cursed, bewitched by enemies of Spain, by angry spirits, by witches who forgot which end of the baby was up. This is where his nickname was born. El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Not exactly the kind of name you want when you're trying to project royal authority. Other monarchs got cool titles like the Great, or the Lionheart. Charles, he got the guy who probably has demons. But this wasn't just playground mockery. In a hyper-religious 17th century Spain, being bewitched was considered a legitimate diagnosis. If you couldn't explain something with scripture or superstition, it clearly came from the devil. And if that devil made his home in the king's body, then the entire empire was in trouble, which, to be fair, it already was. Rumours spread that Charles's strange appearance and behaviours were the result of black magic. Some said an enemy kingdom had cursed the royal womb. Others said Charles had been possessed before birth. A few whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop marrying cousins. But that was obviously heresy. So here was Spain's royal baby, drooling, fragile, and already the subject of an ecclesiastical horror story. His entire life was shaped by a belief that he was less a ruler and more a living omen of divine punishment. And this belief wouldn't just follow him, it would dominate him. Every cough, every twitch, every failed attempt to walk or speak was seen not as illness, but as evidence that something dark and supernatural had taken root in the very heart of the monarchy. No pressure, kid. So why did it suck to be Charles II of Spain? Because before he could crawl, people thought he was cursed. because his genetic deck wasn't just stacked, it was on fire. Because when he opened his mouth, half of Europe heard the death rattle of a dynasty, and because his family tree wasn't a tree, it was a pretzel. While baby Charles II was busy trying to figure out which end of the spoon to chew on, the world around him was collapsing like a flan in a cupboard. Spain, the mighty empire of sun, silver and swordplay, was by 1661 a staggering old man in an oversized suit of armor, pretending everything was fine while its insides quietly crumbled. You see, there was a time not long before Charles's arrival when Spain was the absolute top dog of Europe, a globe-spanning empire with colonies in the Americas, the Philippines, chunks of Italy, a good portion of the Netherlands, and more gold than a dragon's hoard on payday. The Spanish Armada was the stuff of legends. Catholicism was its proud export. Everyone else was either under Spanish boots or nervously glancing at their borders. But by the time Charles was born, Spain had traded in its swagger for a stress ulcer. The empire was exhausted. Wars had drained its treasury like a broken wine barrel. The silver mines in the Americas, still running, but the cost of extracting, transporting, and defending all that treasure was bankrupting the crown. Inflation ballooned, debt ballooned harder, and the leadership. Well, let's just say Charles wasn't the only royal with questionable decision-making skills. Spain had a habit of betting all its coins on wars it couldn't win, and then borrowing money to do it again. By 1661, the country was limping through history like a knight who'd misplaced his horse, armor, and pants. Now zoom out a bit. Europe at the time was a messy neighborhood where everyone threw dinner parties with knives. The Protestant Reformation had turned the religious map into a scribbled coloring book of them versus us. The 30 Years' War had just wrapped up in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, and while it technically ended the constant murder fest, it didn't exactly make everyone best friends. Spain, being firmly Catholic, wasn't just dealing with economic collapse, it had to keep one eye on France's eternal frenemy, another on England, emerging pain in the rear, and yet another on the Protestant north. Too many heretics, not enough firewood. In this fun geopolitical game of guess who hates you, Spain was losing badly. But back home, something far more Spanish was going on. Religious paranoia at industrial strength. If the 17th century had a motto, it would be something like, when in doubt, blame the devil. This was not a chill time to be alive. Science was still the awkward cousin nobody invited to family dinners, and most people thought germs were just rude smells. So when things went wrong, and they always did, there was only one explanation that made sense. Satan, crops failed. Satan, your cow got sick. Satan, you stubbed your toe on a church pew. Definitely Satan. Possibly also your neighbor, who might be a witch. Spain, being deeply Catholic, had turned this logic into an art form, and they had an official branch of government dedicated to rooting out Satan's interns, the Inquisition. Yes, that famous band of overachievers who thought torture was a helpful way to clarify your beliefs. Still operating well into Charles's lifetime, the Spanish Inquisition wasn't just a historical footnote, it was alive, twitching and still enthusiastically poking people with red-hot iron for the good of their souls. This brings us to poor baby Charles, who didn't so much roll into the world as flop into it with a soft thud. In a society where everything was interpreted as a divine message, his birth was not a cause for pure celebration. It was more like a spiritual crime scene. People examined his drooling mouth, weak limbs, and inability to hold up his own head, and thought, this is no ordinary baby. This is cosmic punishment wrapped in velvet. There were no geneticists around to quietly explain that centuries of cousin marrying might be the culprit. Instead, theologians stepped in. Priests, superstitious courtiers. Maybe the kingdom had sinned. Maybe the royal family had allowed some Protestant idea to sneak in through a letter. Maybe someone sneezed during Mass. In short, if Charles was broken, then someone had invited the devil to brunch. And just to be clear, Charles's condition wasn't seen as tragic. It was seen as proof that Spain was in spiritual decline, that God's divine spotlight had dimmed, and now his wrath was leaking through the royal womb like judgment gravy. Omens were everywhere, if you looked hard enough. A black cat darted across the royal courtyard, sign of doom. Lightning struck a church bell, proof of divine anger. Charles refused to speak at age 5. Clearly a demon had taken residence in his tongue and was renting it at market price. The line between medicine and metaphysics was so blurry, It might as well have been scribbled in crayon. Physicians consulted both anatomy books and horoscopes. Surgeons performed bloodletting while murmuring prayers, and astrologers were paid handsomely to tell the king that yes, Mercury was definitely in retrograde, and that was why the baby smelled funny. So if you were alive in Spain in 1661, you didn't see Charles as just another unfortunate royal. You saw him as a walking divine memo, a cosmic red flag, a celestial reminder that Spain, the once invincible empire, had ticked off the Almighty, and now had a malformed monarch as its reluctant mascot. Because if your crops failed, it was the devil. If your wife left you, it was the devil. And if your new baby king drooled too much, yep, devil again. Imagine being born into the most powerful family in Spain, and still having less freedom than a goldfish in a shot glass. That was life for young Charles II, a royal child in name, but in function more like a fragile Fabergé egg no one dared touch, let alone let out of the box. Charles's childhood wasn't filled with the usual royal pastimes, hunting falcons, throwing feasts, or pretending to joust with his cousins. Well, assuming they weren't all also too weak to stand. No, Charles's early years were defined by two things: his body not cooperating, and his mother acting like the kingdom's full-time babysitter and part-time dictator. Let's start with the boy himself. Charles didn't so much develop as he lingered. While other toddlers were taking wobbly first steps and shouting incoherent words like mama and mine, Charles was busy trying to remember how to blink. He didn't walk until around age 4, and didn't speak coherently until much later. Some accounts say he couldn't talk intelligibly until age 8, while others claim he mostly just made confused noises like a sad accordion being sat on. And look, royal kids usually get the best of everything: tailored tutors, imported toys, and chefs who can carve your porridge into a unicorn. But even the finest education can't do much when your royal pupil is too weak to sit up straight and gets tired halfway through a sentence. Charles's medical charts, if you could call them that, were more dramatic than a telenovela. He suffered from a host of issues: seizures, drooling, chronic fatigue, facial asymmetry, jaw malformation, and general developmental delays. If something could go wrong in a Habsburg heir, it probably did. His lower jaw was so massive, and his tongue so oversized, that chewing and speaking were considered Olympic-level challenges. Eating was a full-body event, and swallowing probably deserved applause. But while Charles struggled with basic motor skills, Spain was struggling with a different problem entirely: his mother, Mariana of Austria. Now Mariana wasn't a villain. Not exactly. She loved her son, genuinely. But she also loved being in charge, and since Charles was basically a human paperweight with a crown, Mariana became the de facto ruler of Spain, and she was not letting go. She smothered Charles in a level of overprotection usually reserved for antique dolls and the last piece of wedding cake. Everything was controlled: who could see him, what he could eat, what doctors were allowed near him. It was all under Mariana's iron, perfumed grip. And when I say she ran the kingdom, I mean she ran the kingdom. She sat in council meetings. She handled state papers. She made military decisions. Meanwhile, Charles was busy learning how to point at things without falling over. But Mariana wasn't acting in a vacuum. Oh no, the Spanish court was a political cage match, and Charles was the unwilling mascot in the center of the ring. There were two major factions vying for power like a reality show with no eliminations: the Austrian party and the pro-French party. Both saw Charles not as a person, but as a royal chess piece that drooled. The Austrian faction wanted to keep Spain close to the Holy Roman Empire. More cousins, more comfort. The French side wanted to buddy up with Louis XIV, the swaggering Sun King who was practically glowing with ambition and cologne. Charles, of course, had zero say in any of this. He was too busy being carried from room to room like a delicate vase. His signature was practiced, his presence was ceremonial, and when decisions were made by the king, they were actually made by whoever had whispered into Mariana's ear most effectively that week. At court, backstabbing was a competitive sport. Ministers bribed, schemed, and gossiped. Priests warned of omens. Advisors fought over whether Charles should be seen in public at all. Some said hiding him would prevent scandal. Others said parading him around would prove Spain's monarchy still had a pulse. Meanwhile, Charles was just trying to learn how to ride a horse without immediately sliding off. And the worst part? Every decision about his upbringing was filtered through politics. Should he have more tutors? Only if the tutor's loyalty aligned with the right faction should he be married off early. Only if the bride's country could provide a solid alliance should he have more freedom. Absolutely not. He might say something unscripted, and that was dangerous, because ultimately, Charles's childhood was less playing with toy swords, and more being used as one in a political slap fight. He wasn't a boy, he was a symbol of hope for Spain's stability, a symbol of God's supposed will, a symbol for every backroom deal and whispering noble, hoping to pull the puppet strings just a little tighter. And through it all, Charles was there, blank-eyed, tired, confused, and probably wondering why every adult around him seemed to care more about France than they did about his ability to chew bread without choking. If you were sick in 17th century Spain, your best case scenario was that your doctor had clean hands. Your worst case scenario, that he thought your spleen needed balancing and prescribed boiling your urine under the full moon. Unfortunately for Charles II, King of Spain and biological catastrophe in progress, his health wasn't just poor, it was a full-blown Renaissance medical riddle, wrapped in mystery, wrapped in another layer of leeches. Let's start with his symptoms. Charles's body was like a parade of misfiring organs. He suffered from severe developmental delays, chronic fatigue, intense gastrointestinal problems, drooling, partial paralysis, frequent infections, impotence, and enough neurological quirks to make Freud sit up in his grave and say, "I have questions." And what did 17th century Spanish medicine make of this? Well, in the age of powdered wigs and powdered arsenic, medical science had all the precision of a blindfolded juggler during an earthquake. First up on the medieval treatment checklist, bloodletting. The logic here was simple and terrifying. Feeling tired? You've got too much blood. Headache? Definitely too much blood. Not dead yet. Time to lose a pint. Charles was regularly bled, sometimes by opening veins, other times using leeches, who were probably the only ones enjoying their job. Royal physicians believed that by balancing the humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, they could fix whatever was ailing him. Unfortunately, what Charles needed was not less blood, but fewer centuries of inbreeding, and maybe a decent vitamin. But bloodletting was just the warm-up. Next on the royal to-do list, purging. This involved forcing the king to vomit, or evacuate his bowels in spectacular fashion. You see, if anything was wrong inside you, the obvious solution was to violently eject your insides. Charles was given laxatives, emetics, and even enemas with exotic herbal mixtures, so powerful they could probably clean a chimney. He was once prescribed a combination of rhubarb, senna, and mercury. That's right, mercury. The silvery poison. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that nothing screams healing like casual elemental toxicity. Imagine being so sick you can't sit up straight, and then being told the cure is to spend 3 days on the chamber pot and chase it with a dose of liquid metal. Mercury deserves its own paragraph because, frankly, it tried to kill Charles several times. Doctors thought mercury could stimulate sluggish organs. What it actually did was rot the kidneys, fry the brain, and cause massive tremors, which ironically made Charles look even more cursed. Historians believe Charles was given mercury not just as a one-off, but regularly, especially for his issues with infertility and excess moisture. Yes, that was a thing. The result? Likely a worsening of his neurological symptoms, permanent damage to his already strained body, and a light metallic sheen of doom. Now, let's zoom out and ask the big question. What was actually wrong with Charles II? Thanks to modern medicine, and some brave historians willing to comb through ancient autopsy reports and royal letters, we have a few strong theories. Hydrocephalus. Charles may have suffered from an accumulation of fluid in the brain, causing pressure, developmental delays, and cranial deformities. Not good news in any century, but especially not when your doctors think trepanning drilling a hole in your skull might help. Endocrine disorders. Some researchers believe he had multiple hormonal deficiencies, particularly hypopituitarism. This would explain his small stature, delayed puberty, and infertility. Back then, though, any sign of sexual dysfunction wasn't treated with empathy, but with more mercury. The Habsburg jaw. Of course, no chapter on Charles would be complete without his iconic mandible. Charles's jaw was so distended he could barely close his mouth or chew. It wasn't a unique feature. It was a family curse, passed down like a bizarre genetic heirloom. The technical term, mandibular prognathism, caused by generations of uncle-niece marriages that turned the family gene pool into something more like gene soup. Immune disorders, his frequent infections, fatigue, and inability to recover from minor illnesses suggest his immune system was about as reliable as a 17th century map of Atlantis. All in all, Charles was a walking medical museum. Exhibit A in why marrying your cousin 5 times in a row might not be the brightest dynastic strategy. And what about the rest of the treatments? Aromatic herbs, poultices of mashed toads, and the occasional pilgrimage to a holy relic. One doctor recommended Charles sleep with a dried mole on his chest to absorb bad spirits. Another insisted on reciting protective psalms while applying mustard paste to his feet. Medicine and magic weren't separate. They were tag-teaming his immune system like a pair of drunken wrestlers. At the end of the day, Charles didn't stand a chance. He was fighting centuries of genetic roulette, a healthcare system built on medieval guesses, and a royal court that confused superstition for science. Every prescription was a gamble, and the house always won. If you ever wondered what it's like to run a kingdom with the mental stamina of a half-cooked flan, while surrounded by people who believe sneezing near a black cat is a political omen, welcome to Charles II's royal court. The Spanish court under Charles wasn't just dysfunctional, it was a full-blown medieval telenovela, complete with backstabbing nobles, power-hungry regents, and the ever-present scent of incense and conspiracy. At the center of this swirling vortex of dysfunction was a king who, through no fault of his own, made an easy target for everyone with a dagger or a family tree they were looking to grow into a throne. Let's start with Queen Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother and unofficial puppet master. When Charles became king at the ripe age of 3, someone had to govern on his behalf, and Mariana stepped up like any power-loving Habsburg would, with a firm grip, a rosary in one hand, and a very long list of people she didn't trust. Mariana wasn't just a devoted mother, she was also a deeply pious, wildly superstitious, and politically savvy operator. Think of her as the kingdom's helicopter mom, but instead of worrying about grades, she was worrying about whether demons were possessing her son, and if the court chaplain was loyal to the right celestial power. During her regency, Mariana essentially ruled Spain, though ruled might be generous. More accurately, she refereed a non-stop bar fight between nobles, clerics, and bureaucrats, all of whom were convinced they were the rightful holders of power, and that everyone else was definitely in league with Satan. Spain's nobility didn't need much encouragement to devolve into civil chaos, but Charles's weakened condition provided the perfect excuse for every faction, clique, and cousin with a crest to try their luck at controlling the throne. There were the Austrian faction, loyal to Charles's mother, and deeply pro-Habsburg, because hey, who doesn't love more inbreeding? The pro-French camp, angling to marry Charles off to someone who could smuggle baguettes and alliances into the Spanish bloodstream. The Jesuits, who believed the answer to everything was more prayers, more fasting, and possibly more candles. And of course, the anti-Marianists, who wanted the Queen Mother gone, and probably fantasized about sending her to a very remote nunnery with no political influence, and very bad tea. These factions weren't just whispering behind curtains, they were writing pamphlets, bribing courtiers, forging documents, and occasionally accusing one another of sorcery or treason. It was like a political dodgeball game, where everyone had a rock instead of a ball, and no one agreed on the rules. In all this chaos, Charles II was less a king, and more a royal paperweight. His physical and cognitive limitations left him entirely dependent on his advisors, most of whom saw him not as a person, but as a living seal of approval. If you could get the king to nod at your idea, or simply be too tired to say no, congratulations, you just passed a law. He was constantly shuffled between influencers, who all claimed to have his best interests at heart, which in royal speak means they definitely, 100% did not. While Charles quietly drooled or stared off into space during council meetings, dukes and cardinals launched full-blown power plays right in front of him. In a way, the royal court was like a haunted house, filled with strange noises, flickering candles, shadowy figures, and absolutely no escape from the creeping dread that someone was about to poison your dinner or marry your cousin for land rights. Oh, and let's not forget the superstition. The court was soaked in it. If Charles had a bad day, someone blamed it on a curse. If a noble's horse tripped, it was probably witchcraft. The boundary between diplomacy and demonology was paper-thin. Queen Mariana, ever the devoted Catholic, often leaned into this, inviting priests to bless the palace, burn incense, and chase away evil spirits. On several occasions, exorcisms were conducted, not just on Charles, but on the royal court itself. Because if the king can't walk straight or speak coherently, surely that's not genetics. That's Lucifer doing jazz hands in the throne room. Add to that the ever-lurking inquisition, and a constant supply of omens, bad harvest, someone saw a black goat, and you've got a government that's not just ineffective, it's spiritually exhausting. The defining feature of Charles's court wasn't governance, it was paranoia. Every letter might be a plot, every dinner guest could be a poisoner, every noble ally might be working for France, or the Pope, or worse, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. No one ever trusted that guy. At one point, a faction even suggested removing Charles entirely and appointing a new regent, claiming the king was possessed or cursed. The idea was so popular in some corners that court astrologers were brought in to see if the stars agreed, because if you can't trust your monarch, trust Mercury, the planet. Not the poison though, both featured heavily in Charles's life. So while Charles II technically wore the crown, the Spanish court was a full-blown supernatural soap opera, a place where power was temporary, loyalty was rented, and if someone smiled at you in the corridor, they were probably trying to curse your chickens. Let's talk about love, royalty, and profound awkwardness. The triple crown of Charles II's marital life. In theory, being king came with a few perks: divine right, infinite capes, and at least one strategic marriage to a woman you'd never met, but were now spiritually, politically, and biologically expected to impregnate. For Charles II, this final expectation would go down like everything else in his reign, disastrously, confusingly, and with the entire empire watching in horrified fascination. Charles had 2 royal wives, and somehow both marriages managed to be politically crucial, emotionally strained, and reproductively barren, which in 17th century Spain meant everyone assumed either witchcraft, God's punishment, or that someone hadn't fasted properly before the wedding night. Let's meet the unlucky ladies. Marie-Louise of Orleans, the unhappy import. In 1679, Spain welcomed Marie-Louise of Orleans, a young French princess who was everything Charles II was not: healthy, charming, and able to walk and talk simultaneously. She was just 17, fluent in court etiquette, and had been trained her entire life to be a queen. What she hadn't trained for, however, was being married to a man whose family tree resembled a cursed pretzel, and whose idea of flirtation was, well, surviving the conversation. The match was the result of tense Franco-Spanish diplomacy, with Louis XIV of France playing puppet master behind the scenes. To sweeten the deal, the French king sent his niece off with a massive dowry, some fancy dresses, and probably a few whispered prayers that she wouldn't die of confusion before consummation. Upon arrival, Marie-Louise quickly realized 2 things. Spain was bleak compared to the glittery French court, and her new husband was not the charming prince she'd imagined. Charles reportedly adored her, in the way a confused toddler adores a shiny object. He showered her with gifts, attention, and bewildered devotion, but he also lacked the physical and emotional health to build a functional marriage, or, more critically to the court, produce an heir. Now, in a normal royal union, the absence of an heir, after a few months, might spark mild concern. After a year or 2, panic. After 10 years, you could hear the whispers from Madrid to Mexico. The gossip flew like pigeons on espresso. Was the queen barren? Was the king cursed? Did a witch sneak into their wedding bed disguised as a footstool? Every time Marie-Louise fell ill, failed to conceive, or simply looked tired, someone accused her of sabotaging the dynasty. Meanwhile, Charles, who by all accounts was physically incapable of reproduction due to a mix of hormonal disorders and severe deformities, was never publicly blamed, because clearly the woman who bathed regularly and ate vegetables must be the suspicious one. The pressure mounted. Marie-Louise, isolated in a foreign court, constantly under scrutiny, and grieving her inability to have children, began to wither emotionally and physically. In 1689, she died suddenly at the age of 26. The official cause, acute appendicitis. The unofficial cause, according to half of Spain, witchcraft. because when in doubt, blame a crone. Maria Anna of Neuburg, the heir gambler, enter wife #2. Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess who came with something Marie Louise hadn't, a family with an impressive record of fertility, as in, her mother gave birth to 23 children and still had time to attend state functions. To Spanish officials, this was like importing a championship racehorse. Surely Maria Anna would succeed where her predecessor had failed. The wedding went ahead in 1690. The kingdom held its breath. The priests prepared the baptismal fonts. The nobility placed their bets. And then, nothing. The new queen found herself trapped in a nearly identical nightmare. Charles, now visibly deteriorating in both health and coherence, remained utterly incapable of fathering a child, no matter how many novenas were said or goats were sacrificed in remote villages. To make matters worse, Maria Anna didn't exactly like Charles. She tolerated him, and occasionally tried to steer the court in her favor, but she also reportedly mocked his condition in private and clashed with his inner circle. When the miracle heir failed to materialize, blame circled back like a vulture with a grudge. This time, it was Maria Anna who faced the accusations of dark magic, particularly from pro-French factions still loyal to the memory of wife #1. Some even claimed she had intentionally cursed Charles to stay queen forever, because clearly, this was the dream job, married to a dying monarch, babysitting a nation with no future, and surrounded by ministers who thought comets were divine text messages. By the late 1690s, the Spanish court had moved beyond hope into wild speculation. Fertility experts were summoned. Holy relics were placed under the royal bed. Charles drank potions, said prayers, and may have even undergone a few ritual cleansings, which in 17th century Spain probably involved donkey hair and optimistic monks. Still, no heir, no future, no peace. And so, with 2 failed marriages, no successor, and a court that blamed everything on Satan, Charles became not just a king but a walking fertility crisis. His body symbolized the collapse of the dynasty, and his empty crib echoed louder than any war drum. If you thought the court drama and medical disasters were wild, just wait until we dive headfirst into the magical thinking that turned Charles II's reign into a full-blown supernatural circus. In a time when science was still figuring out if the earth was round or not, the preferred royal medical treatment wasn't a scalpel or a cure. It was a spritz of holy water, an exorcism, and a good old-fashioned witch hunt. Charles II wasn't just a sick king. To many, he was a walking symbol of divine punishment. If your ruler looked like a human question mark, and stumbled around like he'd lost a wrestling match with an invisible demon, obviously, the heavens were sending a message. Spain was deeply Catholic. No, scratch that. Deeply, deeply Catholic. The Inquisition, infamous for sniffing out heresy and witchcraft, with the zeal of a terrier on a scent trail, still had plenty of teeth left. If you were unfortunate enough to be near the royal family during Charles's reign, you were under constant suspicion of having some demonic influence. So what did the experts, that is, the clergy, say? Simply put, Charles was possessed, or bewitched, as his nickname El Hechizado suggests. They believed demons had taken up residence in his liver, his mind, and probably even his shoes. Modern medicine might blame genetic disorders and endocrine problems, but in 17th century Spain, the explanation was much simpler and more terrifying. Doctors? Don't even think about it. When you suspect your king's problems are demonic, why bother with boring anatomy lessons or bleeding him to death with leeches? Instead, the royal chapel became a battleground between heaven and hell, with priests armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayer books to exorcise the demons, living rent-free in Charles's body. Imagine the scene: Charles, weak and confused, probably wondering if his palace had turned into a haunted house, while a team of chanting priests sprinkle water everywhere on the king, the walls, the confused courtiers, even the family dog. One chronicler of the time described the rituals as loud enough to wake the dead, which, depending on your take, could be seen as either a desperate medical intervention or an early precursor to heavy metal concerts. But it didn't stop with just the king. Entire courts, and sometimes entire villages, were roped into mass prayers and public rituals, hoping to drive out the invisible evils. In some cases, this looked like processions through Madrid, with candles, incense, and dozens of nervous nobles trying to look pious while silently praying that their own heads wouldn't be next on the chopping block. The Spanish Inquisition also upped its game during these years. Whenever something went wrong, crop failures, plague outbreaks, or simply the king's latest health setback, someone was accused of using sorcery or consorting with demons. It was a time when bad luck and personal grudges turned into supernatural warfare, and accusations could fly faster than arrows. In today's world, doctors get headaches and prescribe aspirin. Back then, if your king was ill, the priest diagnosticians had to go deeper. He's got demons in his liver. The devil's playing ping pong with his brain. His humours are out of balance because a witch spat on his boots. These colourful diagnoses didn't just stay in hushed whispers. They shaped policy, court intrigue, and even how medicine was practiced for years. It's worth remembering that the royal physicians weren't just treating Charles, they were also terrified of the consequences if they failed. After all, claiming your king was possessed by demons was the safest explanation. If you suggested something like genetics or poor health, you risked being labelled a heretic yourself. Better to splash some holy water and pray for the best. Now, unwitching wasn't just an awkward term invented by frustrated priests. It was a whole industry of rituals, charms, and sometimes brutal trials. People accused of casting spells on the king, which could include anyone from courtiers jealous of the queen to unlucky servants caught sneezing during a prayer, found themselves dragged before the Inquisition's judges. Being labelled a witch or sorcerer was not a good career move. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to imprisonment, or worse. But hey, at least you had the honour of being blamed for the king's problems, which, as you might guess, was both a dubious and dangerous privilege. The paranoia reached such heights that even Charles's closest advisors kept a suspicious eye on each other. If your rival caught a cold, that might be proof they were summoning dark spirits. If the king hiccuped during an audience, well, clearly the demons were acting up again. What made all this worse? The fact that actual science was still in diapers. Germ theory, unknown. Genetics, science fiction. Doctors relied on ancient texts, guesswork, and worst of all, the powerful influence of religious dogma. So instead of understanding Charles's condition as a medical issue, it became a cosmic battle between good and evil, where the best hope was for demons to get bored and leave. This magical thinking dominated the court and the kingdom. People prayed more than they worked. Priests dictated more than doctors, and the king, he was less a ruler and more a tragic figure, caught in a religious and political storm that made his physical ailments look like child's play. Looking back, the tragic thing isn't just Charles's health, it's the way fear and superstition turned him into a puppet, not just of men, but of myths. The idea of a bewitched king shaped how history remembers him, less a man, more a legend. And while today we can laugh at the absurdity of it all, holy water instead of medicine, really, it's a reminder of how desperate people get when faced with the unknown. So the next time you feel a cold coming on, be grateful you don't live in 17th century Spain, where you might be dunked in holy water before you even get an aspirin. By the time Charles II stumbled, sometimes literally, into adulthood, the kingdom he inherited looked less like a golden empire and more like a slowly leaking bucket. And while most kings would be sharpening their swords, or at least sharpening their wits, Charles's reign was marked by a combination of well-meaning but often clueless attempts to rule, and the inevitable power grabs by those around him. Let's be honest, Charles never really ruled in the way you might picture a king. He wasn't exactly a master strategist or fiery leader. In fact, his reign was more about surviving the day without falling off his throne than steering Spain through the turbulent seas of 17th century politics. Think of him less as a lion on the throne, and more as a very confused house cat, who sometimes accidentally knocks over a priceless vase. The court knew this too well. Instead of letting Charles make major decisions, which he probably couldn't, they preferred to run the show behind the scenes, pulling the strings while the king played his part as the sovereign figurehead. Charles's weaknesses were well known at court, and many factions saw him as the perfect figure to manipulate for their own gain. Nobles, priests, and advisors all vied to be the one whispering in his ear, or occasionally planting orders directly in his pockets, literally or metaphorically. Imagine a medieval game of tug-of-war, but with a very delicate and fragile rope, because Charles himself was fragile, physically and mentally. These power players would often fight tooth and nail to control the king's decisions, deciding everything from foreign alliances to domestic policies, all while Charles nodded politely, or sometimes just stared off into space, probably wondering if someone would fetch him a snack. One thing Charles did grasp tightly was his religious faith. You could say he was devout to the point of obsession. If ruling was like trying to drive a car, Charles often preferred to kneel and pray beside the dashboard, rather than actually touch the steering wheel. He was fascinated by relics, supposed holy objects like pieces of the true cross or saints' bones. These were not just curiosities. Charles believed they held miraculous powers to protect him and the kingdom. Court chapels were filled with relics he collected or requested, and some reports say he even carried small ones in his pockets like good luck charms. Because when you're a king who can barely stand and your advisors can barely agree on lunch, divine intervention sounds like a pretty good backup plan. Unfortunately, while Charles was busy counting saints' bones and praying for miracles, Spain's problems didn't pause for prayers. The empire was crumbling slowly but surely. The once mighty Spanish fleets struggled to keep their hold on colonies. Economic troubles ran rampant. Inflation was high, trade routes were contested, and the treasury was practically begging for mercy. Internally, corruption and inefficiency were widespread. The government apparatus was bloated with favoritism and nepotism. Instead of innovation or reform, the state limped along with patchwork fixes and decisions made by whoever happened to be the loudest faction that day. The military was a shadow of its former glory too. Wars dragged on with little clear purpose, and Spain's enemies, like France and the Dutch Republic, snatched up influence and territory whenever possible. Despite all this, Charles did try to exercise royal authority on occasion. Although with limited success, he signed decrees and held court, but these acts were often symbolic or heavily influenced by his advisors. Sometimes his decisions seemed puzzling, as if he were playing political pinball, bouncing from one faction's advice to another's without a clear strategy. For example, he occasionally intervened in noble disputes or made appointments that pleased certain groups, but these moves often backfired or just added fuel to the court's already blazing inferno of intrigue. Picture Spain under Charles II, like a vintage car with the engine overheating, a busted radiator, and a driver who isn't quite sure how the pedals work. The kingdom kept moving forward, but it was clear that something had to give. Economic stagnation, military defeats, and diplomatic isolation combined to set Spain on a slow-motion crash course. Meanwhile, neighbors like France were modernizing and expanding their influence, leaving Spain scrambling to keep up. Yet, no amount of prayers, relics, or royal proclamations could mask the fact that Charles II was the last gasp of a fading dynasty. If you imagine Charles II trying to govern like a toddler handed a steering wheel, it's not far off. He may have been a good-natured toddler, but the political road was filled with potholes, traps, and rival drivers ready to crash the party. Sometimes it feels like Charles was less a king and more a bystander on his own throne, watching Spain slip through his fingers while everyone around him bickered and plotted. In the end, Charles II's reign is a tragic mix of a man limited by his own body and mind, and a kingdom slipping into decline amid superstition, intrigue, and bad luck. He wasn't the kind of king who reshaped history or inspired legends of conquest. Instead, his story is one of survival against odds, a court circus, and a slow-motion collapse that left Spain gasping for breath. But hey, at least he had his relics, and those holy bones sure beat a leaking crown any day. If Charles II's life was a slow, tragicomedy of errors, his death was the grand finale. The moment when everything spectacularly fell apart, and Europe decided it was time to throw a massive tantrum that would echo for over a decade. By the late 1690s, Charles was barely hanging on. The same fragile body that stumbled through childhood was now withering under the weight of years of poor health, bizarre treatments, and a lifetime of court intrigue. Physically, he was a shell of a man, frail speech often slurred or absent, and plagued by chronic pain. Mentally, well, Charles never quite had a grip on the complexities of ruling, and with age, his faculties declined even further. His court watched, half in pity, half in fear, as their king hovered on the brink. Yet, despite his limited capacity to act, Charles remained Spain's sovereign, still the legal heart of an empire gasping for breath. As his health failed, the question on everyone's lips was, who would inherit the throne? Charles II's lack of an heir was the biggest ticking time bomb of his reign. Remember those 2 marriages with 0 children? Well, it wasn't for lack of trying, or at least trying to appear to try. Faced with no direct successor, Charles had to make a choice, and he did. One that shocked Europe. He named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince from France, as his heir. This decision wasn't just a royal will. It was a loaded political grenade. By placing a French prince on the Spanish throne, Charles effectively promised the crown would pass out of the Habsburg family line and into the hands of the powerful Bourbon dynasty, which ruled France. To many, this spelled trouble, because Spain and France were the 2 biggest powers on the continent, and Europe didn't want a super empire controlled by one family. Charles's death in November 1700 unleashed a chain reaction that soon escalated into one of the most destructive conflicts of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. It was basically a giant European shouting match, but instead of words, the shouting came in the form of armies marching, cannons booming, and millions of lives caught in the crossfire. The other European powers, England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and others, were terrified of Bourbon dominance and quickly formed a coalition to oppose Philip's succession. For decades, Europe became a giant battlefield of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles, stretching from Spain itself to Italy, Germany, and even the Americas. Charles II, it turns out, was remarkably talented at causing turmoil without ever having to speak a word. His nickname? El Hechizado. The bewitched might suggest magic, but the real magic was his uncanny ability to cause political disasters just by being himself. His frail health, lack of heirs, and poor political grip set off a domino effect that would haunt Europe for years to come. If Charles had been a chess player, he was the one who kept knocking pieces off the board without meaning to, and then the whole game fell apart. It's almost poetic. Here was a king who didn't need to say anything controversial or make any bold moves to create havoc. Just by existing, and eventually dying, Charles handed Europe a mess so big, historians still argue over who really won the war. Imagine throwing a party where the guest of honor arrives sick, drops a vase, and then leaves without saying goodbye, and suddenly everyone starts yelling at each other. That's basically Charles's legacy. The war drained Spain's already dwindling resources. The empire, which had been limping through Charles's life, stumbled even harder in the decades after his death. Though Philip V eventually secured the throne, Spain was no longer the dominant global superpower it once was. Instead, it became more of a pawn on the European chessboard, often overshadowed by rising powers like Britain and France. Historians love asking what-if questions, and Charles II's reign is full of them. What if he'd been healthier? What if he'd produced an heir? What if he'd ruled with a bit more savvy and less superstition? The reality is, Charles's life and death illustrate how much individual health and family politics could impact the fate of entire nations, and how fragile empires really are. Charles II's death was more than the passing of a monarch. It was the trigger for a continent-wide conflict, a reshaping of power in Europe, and the slow fading of Spain's golden age. He didn't choose to cause a war, but by the time he left the scene, the political landscape was a powder keg ready to blow, and when it did, Europe erupted in flames that would redefine its future. So remember Charles II, the bewitched king, the silent disaster, and the ultimate catalyst of chaos. Why Spain used to rule the world, and how it all went sideways. Welcome to Spain in the 15th century, a land of castles, feuding kingdoms, and more backstabbing nobles than a season of Game of Thrones. But all that changes in 1469, when 2 young royals do something that's considered a miracle in medieval politics. They marry each other instead of murdering each other. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile unite their crowns. And just like that, Spain is born, or at least, Spain the superpower in waiting. Now, don't let the romantic image fool you. This wasn't exactly a love match. It was a power merger with better outfits. Isabella brought money. Ferdinand brought military muscle. Together they brought orthodoxy, order, and oh yeah, world domination. The Spanish power couple. Think of Ferdinand and Isabella as the original power couple goals. If your goal is to combine piety with territorial expansion and kickstart global imperialism before brunch, their first act as co-monarchs, unite the kingdoms, then immediately start purging them. Religious tolerance? Cute idea. But nah. In 1492, a year with a suspiciously high amount of activity, they complete the Reconquista by booting the last Muslim kingdom, Granada, out of Iberia. Then they turn to the Jews and say, convert or leave, and a lot of people left. This isn't the feel-good part of history, but it is crucial. Spain wasn't just unifying borders. It was baking religious conformity into the DNA of the nation. One god, one crown, one language, one very confused boat captain about to head west. Enter. Christopher, I have a vague idea. Columbus. Now here's where Spain goes from medieval makeover to global megaforce. And it starts with a Genoese sailor named Cristoforo Colombo, who shows up like your weird uncle with a treasure map and an investment opportunity. Columbus was convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west. Most educated people of the time, including mapmakers, knew the Earth was round, but they also knew it was bigger than Columbus thought. Columbus? He thought Japan was just west of Portugal. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. He begged Portugal to fund his journey. They passed. He asked Italy. Laughed out the door. Finally, in an act of either genius or pure historical recklessness, Ferdinand and Isabella said yes. Why? Because they'd just finished the Reconquista, had a little extra gold and thought, sure, let's roll the dice on this unwashed sea guy. The world's most profitable wrong turn in October 1492. Columbus accidentally lands in the Bahamas, steps off the ship, and proudly announces that he's reached India. Locals, confused. Columbus, confident. Accuracy, non-existent. And thus begins the most profitable navigational error in history. To be fair, Columbus didn't find gold toilets or silk bazaars, but he did find land, and to 15th century monarchs, land was like Bitcoin. You might not understand it, but you want a lot of it. Spain wasn't just interested in sailing west for curiosity. This was a business venture. You know how today's tech billionaires throw money at startups. Ferdinand and Isabella did that, but with colonization, and Columbus, a man who could barely find his way around the Caribbean, became the face of a new Spanish model. Explore, claim, convert, and extract. Welcome to the world's first colonial franchise. God, glory, and gold. The holy trifecta of imperial branding Spain wasn't just conquering land, it was building a brand. If empires had marketing slogans, Spain's would be God, glory, and gold, in that order, depending on who's watching. God. Bring Christianity to the New World. Whether they wanted it or not. Glory. Make Spain the biggest, most Catholicist power on earth. Gold. Oh, buddy. So much. Gold. But we'll get to that in Chapter 2. Columbus's voyage wasn't just a fluke. It opened the floodgates. Spain suddenly had claim to entire continents, and they weren't going to stop with a few beachheads. Soon, wave after wave of explorers, missionaries and military adventurers would flood the Americas like a Renaissance-era startup boom. And Ferdinand and Isabella, they didn't just get fame, they got papal approval. Pope Alexander VI literally drew a line across the globe and said, yeah, Spain can have that half, Portugal can have the other. This is the kind of global customer service only medieval Christianity could offer. Empire mode, activated by the early 1500s. Spain was no longer just a European kingdom, it was a global power with more ambition than maps. And it all started with one royal marriage, a political purge, and a guy who thought Cuba was China. So the next time you get lost using Google Maps, remember Columbus got lost and accidentally built an empire. You can't even find your keys. Picture this. It's the early 1500s. The Spanish Empire is now turbocharged with ambition, a shiny new worldview, and a compass that may or may not point north. Back home, Spain is still figuring out how to convert its peasants and count its loot. But across the ocean, things are about to get wildly out of hand, because here come the conquistadors, men with swords, muskets, questionable mustaches, and absolutely no chill. These guys weren't your average soldiers. They were like if startup bros carried crossbows. Most weren't even professional military. They were adventurers, mercenaries and nobles with second son syndrome, who thought, you know what, I bet I can find an empire, crush it, and retire with a castle. Spoiler alert, they could, and they did. Enter Hernan Cortés, the uninvited guest of honor. Let's start with the human tornado, that was Hernán Cortés, a minor noble with major ambition. He sails to what we now call Mexico in 1519, lands with a few hundred men, and immediately decides he's going to conquer whatever civilization is dumb enough to have gold and a capital city. That would be the Aztec Empire. At the time, the Aztecs were a full-blown powerhouse, an empire of millions with temples, laws, aqueducts, and a habit of sacrificing people in a way that made even other Mesoamericans go, yikes. Their emperor, Montezuma II, ruled from Tenochtitlan, a city so clean and organized that Cortés and his crew basically walked in and said, "Why does this look nicer than Seville?" But instead of marveling at the engineering and politely leaving, the Spanish did what they did best. They lied, plotted, and handed out disease like party favors. When worlds collide and one's carrying smallpox. Now, it's easy to assume the Spanish steamrolled the Aztecs with superior weapons, but it's more complicated, and frankly weirder than that. First off, the Spanish didn't defeat the Aztecs alone. Cortés managed to turn local politics into an Uno reverse card. He allied with Tlaxcalans, enemies of the Aztecs who were like, "Wait, you want to destroy Montezuma? Cool, we'll bring snacks." Second, while swords and guns were scary, the real MVP was smallpox. The Spanish had been marinating in European plagues for centuries. The Aztecs, not so much. Within a few years, their population was reduced by millions. They didn't just lose battles, they lost entire villages to germs. It was like someone sneezed and accidentally erased an empire. As one priest later wrote, it was as if the gods of old had turned on them. Nah, dude. It was just a coughing Spaniard with bad hygiene. Cortés plays Emperor Jenga. Once in Tenochtitlan, Cortés doesn't wait around. He kidnaps Montezuma, tries to rule through him, and when that doesn't work, he just has the guy killed. Or maybe the Aztecs did. History's a little fuzzy because everyone was busy murdering each other at the time. What follows is known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, when the Spanish tried to sneak out of the city with stolen gold, got caught, and got absolutely wrecked. Hundreds drowned trying to swim with pockets full of treasure. Lesson: don't bring bricks of gold to a river fight. But Cortés regroups, brings more troops, and by 1521, Tenochtitlan is rubble. What once was a majestic island city with canals, markets and palaces became a Spanish parking lot, and the Aztec Empire was officially toast. Meanwhile, down south, the Inca get incinerated. Now, while Cortés was redefining party crasher in Mexico, another Spanish overachiever, Francisco Pizarro, was doing his own version of imperial break-and-enter down in Peru. The Inca Empire was the largest in pre-Columbian America, stretching along the Andes with complex roads, terraced farming, and architecture that could survive earthquakes better than most modern condos. But unfortunately for the Inca, they too had gold. And if Spain had a love language, it was precious metals and unearned glory. Pizarro shows up in 1532 with just 168 men, finds the Inca in the middle of a civil war. How convenient. And arranges a meeting with their emperor, Atahualpa. Instead of talking, he ambushes him, takes him prisoner, and demands a ransom. Atahualpa, confused but cooperative, fills an entire room with gold to buy his freedom. Pizarro takes the gold, then kills him anyway. Classic Conquistador. Soon after, Cusco falls. The empire disintegrates, and Spain, having now toppled two of the largest civilizations in the Americas, with more audacity than manpower, is suddenly the proud owner of more gold than it can carry, and more guilt than it will ever admit to. They came, they saw, they sneezed. The conquistadors weren't just conquerors, they were force multipliers of chaos, unleashing waves of disease, political disruption, and cultural devastation in every direction. Entire civilizations that had thrived for centuries were dismantled in the span of a few years, and not by empires the size of armies, but by a few hundred sunburnt Spaniards with firearms, germs, and wildly misplaced confidence. They didn't conquer because they were better. They conquered because they were luckier, sneakier, and sneakily diseased. They came, they saw, they sneezed, and they wiped out civilizations. By the late 1500s, Spain had the geopolitical energy of a man who just inherited a gold mine and bought a Ferrari. He doesn't know how to drive. It had conquered empires, flooded Europe with silver, and was now the heavyweight champion of Catholic colonialism. There was just one little problem floating across the channel. England, specifically Queen Elizabeth I, who had the audacity to be Protestant, underfunded, and still very good at irritating the most powerful empire on earth. Spain's King Philip II wasn't thrilled. His empire stretched across continents, but somehow, this damp island with terrible weather and a penchant for sarcastic poets kept poking the Spanish lion with a very English stick. Privateers like Sir Francis Drake were raiding Spanish treasure fleets like it was casual afternoon piracy, and the English were backing Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, which Spain was trying very hard to keep Catholic and under control. So Philip had a brilliant idea. Let's build the biggest fleet Europe has ever seen, sail it to England, and force Elizabeth to stop being so Elizabeth. The most ambitious power move of the century. In 1588, La Grande Felicissima Armada, aka the Great and Most Fortunate Navy, irony incoming, was launched. This was no small operation. We're talking 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and around 19,000 soldiers. Add in 17,000 more troops waiting in the Netherlands, and you've got a floating invasion that basically screamed, "We are here to conquer you, and maybe borrow some TA." Philip's grand plan was simple. Sail the Armada up the English Channel, link up with his army in the Netherlands, cross into England, dethrone Elizabeth, install a Catholic puppet, host a very smug after-party in London. Sounds great on parchment, but here's the thing. Spain was good at invading continents, not orchestrating precision amphibious operations in turbulent waters, with 16th century communication systems. And the English? Well, they were about to show just how annoying underdogs can be when they've got fast ships, cheeky commanders, and a strong wind. The Armada arrives. Spain meets English weather. As the Armada sailed into the English Channel, it formed an impressive crescent-shaped battle formation, like a giant floating eyebrow of doom. But the English Navy, under the command of Sir Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, pirate-turned-knight, basically the Batman of the sea, didn't engage in a frontal assault. They knew their strengths, and they weren't big guns and lots of armor. Instead, they had smaller, more maneuverable ships, and a good sense of timing. The English played a deadly game of cat and mouse, harassing the Armada from a distance, and staying just out of range, like naval mosquitoes that carried cannonballs. Then came the legendary night of the fire ships. The English sent burning vessels straight into the anchored Armada at Calais, where the Spanish were trying to rendezvous with their troops. The Spanish ships scattered in panic, cutting their anchors and smashing into one another in the chaos. It was like trying to perform ballet in a parking lot, while someone throws flaming dumpsters at you. The storms steal the show. Still, the Spanish weren't done yet. They were bruised but not beaten. But they did have a problem. They hadn't picked up the army yet. Thanks, Drake. And now the English fleet was chasing them back into open waters. So Philip's plan B, sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland to get back to Spain. A solid idea, if the weather weren't homicidal. The North Atlantic responded like a grumpy sea god with a grudge. Storms battered the Armada relentlessly. Ships ran aground. Some were dashed to pieces on the rocky Irish coast. Others limped home so damaged they were basically glorified driftwood. When it was all over, less than half of the original ships made it back. And the kicker? Philip II blamed it on God. Seriously. He called it divine punishment, and just shrugged. It was not the English who defeated us, he supposedly said, but the wind and the waves. Translation: don't look at me. Poseidon rage quit. Aftermath: England throws shade. Spain gets a nosebleed. The defeat of the Spanish Armada didn't end Spain's empire, but it did shatter the myth of invincibility. For decades, Spain had swaggered through Europe like the final boss of Catholicism, but now, the world saw cracks in the armor. England, despite being the annoying little sibling of empires, had proven that smart strategy and bad weather could humble even the grandest fleets. Elizabeth I capitalized on the victory, throwing portraits of herself next to broken Armada ships, and commissioning speeches that basically said, "Behold the Queen who slapped a superpower." Meanwhile, Spain poured money into rebuilding, but the aura was gone. And rebuilding ships is expensive when you've also got rebellions, inflation, and angry Dutch people on your hands. As for Francis Drake, legend says he celebrated by finishing a game of lawn bowling before sailing out to chase the Armada, which might be the most English power move ever committed. The bottom line: The Spanish Armada was less a battle and more a floating metaphor for overreach, hubris, and trusting the weather too much. Spain had the biggest boats, but they also had the biggest assumptions, and when your plan involves perfect timing, flawless communication, and cooperative weather, history has a habit of smacking you with a lightning bolt and an Englishman with a cannon. Nothing says world domination like your entire fleet getting punked by Sir Francis Drake, salt water, and some very rude clouds. Imagine you win the lottery, not just any lottery, a global, multi-continent, solid gold-wrapped lottery. That was Spain in the 16th century. Thanks to its colonization of the Americas, Spain was hauling in so much precious metal, it practically had to invent new vaults just to hold it all. Galleons came groaning into port, loaded with literal tons of Aztec, Incan, and Andean treasure, and Spain, bless its royal heart, responded the way any suddenly rich empire would. Let's spend it all, immediately, on everything. Twice. It was raining gold, and Spain was dancing in it, while the rest of Europe quietly sharpened their knives. From the 1500s onward, Spain was shipping home enough silver and gold from the New World to cover entire cities in bling. By the peak of the 1590s, it was bringing in hundreds of tons of silver per year, particularly from the Potosi mine in modern-day Bolivia. This mountain was so rich, the Spanish called it the mountain that eats men, and not because it offered free spa treatments. Enslaved indigenous people and later African slaves worked in horrifying conditions, extracting wealth that would eventually fund cathedrals, wars, fashion statements, and some very dramatic hats. But here's the kicker. Spain didn't invest this money. They didn't build industries, diversify the economy, or stash some away for a rainy war. They spent it, lavishly, like a college student with their first credit card, fancy palaces, an army so large it needed a flowchart, wars, lots of them, religious ones, colonial ones. I don't like your beard ones, Catholic counter-reformation campaigns, more palaces, just in case, wigs that could be seen from space. Instead of building up domestic manufacturing, Spain imported goods from Italy, the Netherlands, and France, effectively outsourcing its own economy, while handing its enemies a healthy profit. Spain was the rich kid at Europe High School, who never learned how to do his own homework, because he could just pay everyone else. Here's where it gets awkward. Gold and silver aren't magical. If you flood your economy with precious metals without backing it with actual productivity, you get inflation. That delightful moment when money still exists, but buys you less than a sad piece of stale bread. And boy did Spain inflate. Prices of goods tripled between 1500 and 1600. A loaf of bread that cost 1 marabid in 1500 would cost 3 by 1600, and salaries did not keep up. It's hard to flex gold coins when everyone's starving, and all the sheep are owned by foreign investors. Even worse, most of the money didn't circulate for long. It shot right back out of Spain. The empire became a conduit for wealth, not a container. Gold came in, was used to buy goods and services abroad, and promptly left again. It's like throwing a birthday party, where every guest steals the presents, and you're left with a broken chair and half a cupcake. Spain's monarchy also had a severe allergy to tax reform. The nobility and clergy, the richest and most powerful groups, were largely exempt from taxes. That left the burden on peasants and the urban middle class, which were increasingly poor and increasingly angry. Philip II, he's back, and still not great with math, managed to declare state bankruptcy 4 times. That's not a typo. In 1557, 1575, 1596, and again in 1607, the Spanish crown straight up defaulted. In modern terms, that's like being a Fortune 500 company, with the financial planning of a toddler in a candy store. Each bankruptcy shook investor confidence, raised borrowing costs, and made Spain even more dependent on incoming gold, which, remember, was steadily losing value. By the 1600s, Spain was stuck in an economic loop so bad it would make a hamster cry. Need gold to pay for wars. Wars cost more than gold brings in. Borrow money based on future gold. Default. Repeat. What made it worse was imperial arrogance. Spain's leaders assumed their dominance would last forever. After all, they had divine backing, global colonies, and so much silver they could, and did decorate churches with it. But financial realities don't care about your flags or your crowns. With a crumbling economy, rising social unrest, a tax system that made Robin Hood cry, and foreign merchants sucking wealth out faster than a vampire at a blood bank, Spain's golden age began to rot from the inside. By the end of the 17th century, Spain was no longer the economic powerhouse it once was. It was still a big empire, but more in the way a bloated whale is big. The real power had begun shifting to France, the Netherlands, and especially the scrappy little newcomer across the sea, England, and eventually, centuries later, the United States, a former colony of that annoying island Spain once tried to conquer with boats, would pick up the world power baton Spain had dropped somewhere between bankruptcy #2 and wig purchase #600. The bottom line, Spain turned a new world gold rush into an old world economic disaster. They had the treasure chest, but no idea how to use the map. They didn't just strike gold, they weaponized it, squandered it, and tripped into a century of debt, doing the economic equivalent of making it rain until the floor caved in. All that glitters may not be gold, but in Spain's case, even the gold didn't glitter for long. So you've got an empire. You've got gold, colonies, palaces, fleets, even a solid collection of enemies, but something's missing. What could possibly make this shiny imperial project complete? That's right, religious persecution. Welcome to the Spanish Inquisition, history's least fun surprise party. Founded on fear, fueled by paranoia, and delivered by men in robes who thought jokes were heresy, the Inquisition was Spain's brilliant plan to keep order through the theological equivalent of turning the volume up to 11 and setting the speakers on fire. Let's rewind to 1478, when Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain's original power couple, decided their newly united kingdom needed some spiritual spring cleaning. With the Pope's blessing, because why not, they launched the Spanish Inquisition to make sure everyone, and we mean everyone, was the right kind of Catholic. Jews, Muslims, recent converts, scientists, mystics, freethinkers, and probably that one guy who sneezed funny, were all under suspicion. Spain had conquered vast new territories, but it now wanted to conquer souls, and that meant squinting at your neighbor and wondering if his salad fork usage implied devil worship. The logic was flawless, really. You don't go to church, yes I do, every week. Suspicious. We'll check your kitchen for unleavened bread. The Inquisition wasn't just a court, it was a theatrical event. Trials featured dramatic public confessions, elaborate robes for the condemned, and punishments that made the Middle Ages look like Disneyland. You could be fined, tortured, exiled, or, the deluxe package, burned at the stake. Your accuser, often anonymous. Your evidence could be a dream, a rumor, or the fact that you bathe too often. Your defense, hope you enjoy fire, wasn't officially listed, but it was implied. You know it's bad when not being tortured today becomes a highlight of your week. But here's where things go from terrifying to strategically disastrous. Spain's crackdown didn't just scare heretics. It scared away minds. Any semblance of scientific progress, independent thought, or creative experimentation was treated as dangerous. People with bright ideas learned to either keep their mouths shut or pack up and head to more tolerant places, like France, the Netherlands, or literally anywhere else. This is what we in modern terms might call a bad business decision. While the rest of Europe slowly entered the Renaissance, tinkering with telescopes and pondering gravity, Spain was busy asking whether Aristotle would pass a religious background check. Some examples: Giordano Bruno, burned by the Roman Inquisition. Spain took notes. Galileo, not burned, but gagged. Spanish thinkers were like, better not even look at the stars. Copernicus, you'd have to explain heliocentrism very quietly in a wine cellar with the lights off. Instead of universities becoming centers of thought, they became echo chambers of orthodoxy. If a student asked too many questions, he got promoted from curious to maybe satanic real fast. Not content with just grilling dissenters, Spain went full Orwell and created the Index of Prohibited Books, a list of writings so dangerous they could literally corrupt your soul by glancing at the cover. The printing press, which was spreading new ideas across Europe, became a suspicious object in Spain, almost as dangerous as a book about printing presses. Even fiction was regulated. Don Quixote somehow made it through, probably because they thought it mocked idealism, but anything with philosophical teeth got yanked faster than you can say Descartes. If your society's motto becomes don't read, don't write, don't ask, you're not really setting yourself up for long-term innovation. You're setting yourself up for a quiz show with no contestants. Sure, the Inquisition did create a weird kind of cohesion, if by cohesion you mean making everyone too afraid to sneeze out of rhythm, but the long-term effects were devastating. Jews and Muslims, who had contributed to centuries of intellectual, scientific and economic growth in Spain, were expelled or forced to convert. Morisco's Muslim converts were later expelled too, even if their families had been Christian for generations. Commerce, medicine, and philosophy suffered deep declines. Spain became intellectually isolated from the rest of Europe. The result, a shiny, gold-plated empire on the outside, and a hollow, nervous wreck on the inside. While England and the Netherlands were building financial systems, experimenting with science, and founding colonies, Spain was busy arguing over whether a person who ate fish on the wrong day should be burned. Perhaps the ultimate irony is this. The Inquisition was meant to unify Spain, but it eventually helped fracture it. The fear-based governance model, the suppression of thought, and the forced homogeneity created a brittle empire that couldn't adapt. Because the truth is, empires aren't maintained through paranoia and punishment. They're maintained through flexibility, creativity, and occasionally letting the nerds invent stuff. Spain forgot that. It built a cage for itself out of crosses and courtroom records. And when it looked up and found the world had changed, it couldn't even ask why. Final verdict? The Inquisition wasn't just a religious horror show. It was Spain's way of handcuffing itself to the past, right as the rest of the world was sprinting toward the future. You could say they didn't just burn people, they burned their own shot at long-term greatness. It's one thing to inherit a kingdom, it's another to inherit your cousin's jawline, your uncle's limp, and a handful of recessive genes all wrapped in royal ribbon. Welcome to the genetically glitchy saga of the Spanish royal family, where crowns passed down like family heirlooms. And so did the double chins, hemophilia, and a distressing number of matching grandparents. The House of Habsburg didn't just rule Spain, they dominated half of Europe like the universe was their family reunion. Austria? Check. The Holy Roman Empire? Why not? Burgundy, Naples, the Netherlands, add it to the cart. But with great power came great marriage redundancy. In an effort to keep everything in the family, the Habsburgs embraced the age-old European tradition of, why marry a stranger when you can marry your niece? Seriously, by the time the Habsburgs were done, their royal family tree resembled a pretzel. The result? A spectacular blend of blue blood and genetic bingo gone horribly wrong. At the heart of this hereditary horror show was Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Charles was less a monarch and more a cautionary tale in human biology. Let's break it down. His parents were uncle and niece. His great-grandparents were also cousins. His ancestry chart had fewer branches than a cactus. Charles was born in 1661 and defied the odds by simply surviving infancy. But the victory was short-lived. He had a massive jaw so deformed he could barely chew. He was mostly mute until the age of 4, suffered constant illness, and could barely walk. By adulthood, he was described by foreign ambassadors as short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald by 35. He was also, shockingly, king. A king who couldn't read, or write, or sire an heir, or frankly, rule. But boy, could he drool. Since Charles II had all the mental sharpness of a damp sponge, the real power in Spain wasn't in his hands. It bounced between his advisors, his wives, 2 of them, both unfortunately heirless, and various foreign influences. Imagine a nation run by a confused game of royal telephone. Political factions swirled like a reality show. One moment, it was the Austrian Habsburgs whispering in the king's ear. The next, it was the French Bourbons making plays for succession. The Spanish court had more scheming than a Game of Thrones convention, except, instead of dragons, they had gout. Spain, meanwhile, was falling apart. Its empire was fraying at the edges, its economy was wheezing, and its monarch, bless him, was busy chasing imaginary curses instead of policies. Charles II, after years of confusion, poor health, and royal ghost stories, finally died in 1700 without leaving an heir. But like everything in royal history, he did leave behind a mess. Specifically, the War of the Spanish Succession. Because Charles didn't just die, he left the throne to Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon, and grandson of Louis XIV of France. Naturally, the rest of Europe reacted as calmly as someone discovering their ex is dating their sibling. England, the Netherlands, Austria, and others teamed up to say, nope. What followed was a 13-year multi-continent brawl over who got to wear the Spanish crown. Spoiler, millions died, Europe caught fire again, and the new map of alliances would last for centuries. The real kicker, Spain lost territory, influence and dignity, all because the royal family had been treating DNA like a game of Monopoly. Let's just keep passing go and marrying each other. Eventually, Philip Thieve, the Bourbon candidate, did get the crown, but with strings attached. Spain had to give up its claims to other European thrones and hand over several territories. It was basically the diplomatic version of, you can keep the car, but we're taking the wheels, the radio, and 2 of the tires. Still, the Bourbons brought something revolutionary to the table: genetic diversity. After centuries of Habsburg hobbling, Spain finally had a ruler who didn't look like he had melted. Philip was intelligent, energetic, and capable of reading policy papers. Unfortunately, his reign was also marked by war, depression, literal and economic, and frequent retreats into gloomy melancholia. But hey, at least his family tree had some branches. You might think royal gossip about cousin kissing and genetic collapse is just tabloid fluff for historians, but it had real consequences. Political instability from an inept king delayed reforms. A massive war over the succession sapped Spain's resources. International humiliation chipped away at Spanish prestige. And worst of all, it proved that dynastic arrogance could sabotage an empire from within. Because running a global empire requires more than ships and swords. It also requires a ruler who knows what day it is. Final thought: Spain didn't lose its empire overnight. It lost it generation by generation, by marrying its cousins, ignoring medical science, and confusing divine right with DNA roulette. Charles II wasn't just a king, he was the human version of a warning label. Do not mix power and inbreeding. Results may vary. Spain, by the late 1700s, was that guest at the party who used to own the house, but now just hangs out by the snack table, awkwardly reminding everyone about the good old days. Its empire was battered, its economy limping, and its monarchy, now Bourbon instead of Habsburg, still trying to figure out what all these buttons on the war machine do. And just when things couldn't possibly get worse, France shows up with a revolution, a dictator, and zero respect for personal space. Welcome to the Napoleonic nightmare, a tale of betrayal, incompetence, war, and one very bad decision to let French troops into your country and assume they'll behave themselves. To understand how Spain got here, we have to rewind to the French Revolution. The Bourbons of Spain were understandably horrified when their French cousins started getting decapitated by guys in wigs, yelling about liberté and guillotine discounts. Spain initially fought revolutionary France to defend monarchy, but then changed teams faster than a reality TV contestant. By the late 1790s, Spain had signed treaties with France, effectively becoming Napoleon's reluctant bestie. This meant that, when Napoleon decided to ruin England's weekend with a trade embargo called the Continental System, Spain was expected to play along and block British goods. Spoiler: the British weren't thrilled, but neither were the Spaniards. Here's where things go from awkward to tragic. Napoleon, ever the schemer, proposed a plan to jointly invade Portugal with Spain. Why Portugal? Because they were still trading with the British like it was tea time, and not a global embargo. Spain, eager to earn France's approval and maybe regain some lost dignity, agreed. French troops started marching through Spain in 1807, allegedly just passing through on the way to Lisbon. That's like inviting your cousin to crash on the couch for a week, and finding out they've sold your furniture and installed surveillance cameras. The French didn't stop in Portugal. They began occupying major Spanish cities, casually taking over fortresses, and doing the historical version of, "Oh, we live here now." Before Spain realized it, Napoleon had hijacked the entire country. In 1808, Napoleon really committed to the bit. He forced King Charles IV of Spain and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate, like a family therapy session run by a warlord. He then installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. Because when you think effective Spanish monarch, naturally you think French guy named Joe. The Spanish people responded the only way anyone would when their monarchy is replaced by a guy with zero Spanish blood, and even less charisma. They revolted, violently. The Peninsular War, 1808-1814, was Spain's fiery, chaotic response to Napoleon's power grab. It turned the Iberian Peninsula into a flaming chessboard of empires, rebels, and lots of unnecessary cavalry charges. But Spain didn't fight alone. Enter Britain, led by the delightfully stiff upper-lipped Duke of Wellington, who decided helping Spain resist Napoleon was a great way to ruin France's day and sip tea with moral superiority. Spanish regular armies were often outmatched and outgunned, but the real MVPs of the war were the guerrillas, bands of ragtag fighters who launched surprise attacks, ambushed supply lines, and generally made life for French soldiers about as enjoyable as a wasp-filled hammock. The word guerrilla warfare literally comes from this conflict. It means little war in Spanish, and little wars popped up everywhere. It was gritty, brutal, and incredibly effective. It was also the first time Napoleon really started to lose. While the Spanish resistance was fierce and unrelenting, it came at a horrifying cost. Cities were burned, entire villages wiped out, and the countryside left ravaged by years of conflict. Over 500,000 people died. Infrastructure collapsed. Agriculture stalled. The economy, already a wheezing relic, flatlined completely. And the worst part? Even after Napoleon's defeat, Spain was still broken. In 1814, Ferdinand Stephen was restored to the throne like some grand return of a hero, except he was anything but. He was authoritarian, reactionary, and allergic to the idea of reform. Spain had been given a chance to rebuild, to modernize, to emerge from the ashes stronger. Instead, it chose to rewind the clock. While Spain was busy having its internal crisis, its vast overseas empire, from Argentina to Mexico, looked around and went, "So, we're free now, right?" The chaos in Spain gave independence movements across Latin America the perfect excuse to rise up. Figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín led successful revolutions against Spanish rule, and Spain found itself unable to respond because it had barely pieced its own country back together. It turns out that when your country is on fire, your colonies don't want to send you firewood, they want out. Final thought. Spain entered the Napoleonic era limping and left it crawling. Napoleon may not have started the Spanish decline, but he sure hit the gas pedal. What followed was less empire and more extended breakup. Spain had been one of the world's most powerful nations, and now it was licking its wounds, its influence shattered, and its colonies running for the exit. It wasn't just a war, it was an eviction notice, a family coup, and a lesson in never trusting a Frenchman who brings just a few troops. By the late 19th century, Spain's imperial crown was more rust than gold, once a globe-spanning colossus that claimed everything from the Andes to the Philippines. Spain had now shrunk to a handful of scattered colonies, and even those were restless, rebellious, and just waiting for an opportunity to yeet their way into independence. Enter the United States. Young, ambitious, and suffering from an advanced case of manifest destiny, America was ready to try out its new muscles. It had spent the last century expanding westward and thought, hey, what if we did empire? But first, they needed a test subject. And Spain, limping along with half-mutinous colonies and a fleet that looked like it belonged in a pirate museum, made the perfect opponent. Cuba was Spain's last real jewel in the Caribbean, but it was glowing red with revolution. Cuban independence fighters had been rebelling on and off for decades. By the 1890s, they'd had enough of colonial taxes, political repression, and being told what to do by people in Madrid who had never even seen a sugarcane field. The United States had its eyes on Cuba, not necessarily out of love for freedom, but for economic interests, sugar, tobacco, and the subtle urge to babysit the hemisphere. American newspapers, led by the likes of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, launched a campaign of yellow journalism, printing exaggerated stories about Spanish atrocities. It was like Twitter before Twitter: maximum outrage, minimum facts. When the USS Maine exploded mysteriously in Havana Harbor in February 1898, the media screamed, "Remember the Maine," even though to this day no one is entirely sure what actually caused the blast. But nuance doesn't sell newspapers, war does. President William McKinley, pushed by press, public opinion, and a Congress foaming at the mouth, declared war on Spain in April 1898. Thus began the Spanish-American War, which is less a war and more a 4-month-long beatdown with snack breaks. Spain, already in decline, simply wasn't prepared. Their fleet was outdated, their tactics were decades behind, and their troops were exhausted from trying to suppress endless colonial uprisings. The US, on the other hand, brought shiny new steel warships, railroads, industrial might, and a general attitude of, let's show the world what we've got. The US Navy scored its first victory, not in Cuba, but half a world away in the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey sailed into Manila Bay and vaporized the Spanish Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours. His now famous order, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Translation: let's embarrass them quickly. Back in the Caribbean, American troops landed in Cuba and made headlines by taking San Juan Hill, or rather, a hill near San Juan Hill. Details are fuzzy, but that didn't stop. Theodore Roosevelt, a nearsighted former Secretary of the Navy, turned cowboy cosplay enthusiast, from leading the Rough Riders up the slopes to glory. Roosevelt's charge became the stuff of American legend, which he happily narrated for the rest of his life, probably in the third person, shirtless, and while punching a bear. Spanish troops fought bravely, but their command structure was chaotic, and reinforcements were too little, too late. By August 1898, Spain surrendered, signing an armistice, and later the Treaty of Paris in December. The results? Brutal for Spain. Cuba was granted independence, although the US would hover like an overbearing parent for decades. Puerto Rico became a US territory, where it remains today. Awkwardly American, but not quite. Guam was also handed over to the US, mostly because someone remembered it existed, and the Philippines, after a brief moment of hope for independence, was purchased by the US for $20 million, effectively replacing one colonial master with another. Spoiler: this would spark a whole other war, but that's another story. This war was Spain's final eviction notice from global empire status. It went into the 19th century as a former superpower trying to hold on to relevance, and it exited with the global influence of a mildly interesting antique store. The defeat was a national trauma. Spain had lost its last major colonies, its pride, and any illusion of still being a top-tier power. It was like watching a former Olympic champion trip over a child's scooter. Spanish politicians and intellectuals entered a period of introspection known as the Generation of 98, trying to make sense of the loss and reimagine the nation's future. Spoiler: the 20th century wasn't super kind to them either. For the United States, the Spanish-American War was like puberty. It suddenly had hair in strange places, islands in the Pacific, a louder voice on the world stage, and a newfound swagger it couldn't wait to test out. The US had not just won a war, it had gained a taste for global power projection. The days of isolationism were officially numbered. From this point on, America was no longer just a continental bully. It was ready to crash the global empire party and start hosting its own final thought. The Spain didn't go down swinging, it went down sighing. The Spanish-American War was less about battle tactics and more about tectonic shifts, an old empire collapsing under its own weight and a new one stretching its limbs for the first time. It wasn't just the end of Spain's empire, it was the moment the US stepped up to the global buffet and said, "We'll take one of everything, please." After the humiliation of losing its last major colonies in 1898, Spain wasn't exactly the star of the global stage anymore. If the 19th century had been a wild party where Spain danced with kings and conquered continents, the 20th century felt more like waking up with a hangover and realizing your empire keys are gone, and you're stuck in a slow-motion nap. Spain's 20th century was marked by intense political turmoil, civil war, a decades-long dictatorship, and an economy that shuffled along like a siesta-loving tortoise. The country took a hard time out from world affairs and basically went into hibernation. A dramatic, sometimes tragic, and often baffling hibernation. Spain entered the 20th century deeply divided, politically fragmented, economically struggling, and socially restless. It was a boiling pot of competing ideas. You had monarchists, republicans, anarchists, socialists, communists, fascists, and those who just wanted a quiet cafe and a decent cup of coffee. The monarchy of Alfonso XIII was increasingly unpopular, seen as out of touch and unable to manage the mess. Spain was becoming economic hardship, especially in rural areas, drove widespread unrest. Workers' unions were growing bolder, and regional identities, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country, pushed for more autonomy. By the 1920s, Spain was teetering on the edge, much like a toddler balancing on a wobbly chair but with much more gunpowder around. In 1931, Spain became a republic, but this didn't calm things down. In fact, it ratcheted tensions higher. Political polarization skyrocketed. On one side were the leftists pushing for radical reforms, land redistribution, and secularization. On the other side, conservatives, monarchists, and the Catholic Church dug in their heels. By 1936, Spain plunged into a brutal civil war. It wasn't just a fight for political power, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. The war pitted Republicans, who supported democracy and progressive reforms, against nationalists, a coalition of conservatives, monarchists, and fascists, led by the ambitious General Francisco Franco. This war was intense, savage, and heartbreaking. Entire families were split. Towns were bombed. Remember, this was the era of total war tactics and new technology. Foreign powers got involved, turning Spain into a proxy battleground for ideologies. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy backed Franco, while the Soviet Union supported the Republicans. The US and Britain mostly stayed out, watching nervously. When Franco's nationalists won in 1939, Spain entered one of the longest dictatorships in modern European history, lasting until Franco's death in 1975. Franco's Spain was like a strict school principal who banned fun and free speech, but insisted everyone stay in line and say yes, sir. The regime suppressed political opposition, censored the press, and persecuted anyone who dared challenge the official narrative. Freedom was replaced by fear and conformity. Economically, Spain was isolated and stagnant for much of Franco's rule. The country was cut off from the post-WWIC economic boom that helped rebuild Western Europe. Instead, Spain limped along with rationing, black markets, and an economy heavily reliant on agriculture and outdated industries. By the 1950s, Spain was, bluntly, poor and sleepy. The phrase, empire-themed retirement home, fits well here. Spain still clung to a faint memory of grandeur, but the real focus was staying alive and making it through the day without too much fuss. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, things slowly started to change. Spain's economy began to modernize and open up. Tourism boomed. Hello, sunburned vacationers on the Costa del Sol, and industrialization crept forward. But politically, Spain remained firmly under Franco's boot heel. Democracy and reform were postponed for decades, and dissent was met with imprisonment, or worse. Franco's regime promoted a very conservative and traditional version of Spanish identity. Regional languages like Catalan and Basque were suppressed. The Catholic Church was an influential enforcer of morality and order. Modern art, progressive ideas, and anything resembling rebellion were discouraged. For many Spaniards, this was a frustrating and suffocating era. The country was culturally isolated from the vibrant shifts happening across Europe and the world. The 60s counterculture, civil rights movements, and the sexual revolution mostly passed Spain by like a ghost train. When Franco died in 1975, Spain was finally ready for a reboot. King Juan Carlos I, surprisingly, became the champion of democracy rather than dictatorship, steering the country toward a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. Spain's transition was peaceful but delicate. The scars of civil war and dictatorship ran deep, and tensions between old and new Spain simmered just beneath the surface. Economically, Spain joined the European community, and finally started to shake off the shadow of poverty and stagnation. Culturally, the post-Franco era exploded with new energy, creativity, and openness. Think flamenco meets punk rock. The 20th century for Spain was a dramatic retreat from empire to internal chaos and isolation. Unlike the dramatic conquests and glittering fleets of the past, this century was about survival, identity, and painful reinvention. Spain wasn't ruling the world anymore, but it was figuring out how to rule itself. And sometimes that meant taking a long siesta. Spain's 20th century story is basically once a world boss, now just boss of the siesta. If empires were Netflix series, Spain's 20th century would be the slow, moody middle season. Lots of drama, tension, and not much action, yet you can't look away. So Spain's glory days of ruling the world are long gone. No more fleets crossing oceans with gold stacked high, or conquistadors turning up uninvited and rewriting entire civilizations. But don't start feeling sorry for Spain just yet, because while the empire itself is history, Spain's legacy is alive, kicking and flamenco dancing across the globe. First up, flamenco. No history of Spain's legacy would be complete without this fiery dance and music tradition that practically screams Spain. Flamenco, with its rapid hand claps, soulful guitar, and those dramatic foot stomps, is like the country's emotional soundtrack. It captures centuries of passion, struggle, and celebration, and somehow, it still manages to look effortlessly cool. Flamenco's roots trace back to a mix of Andalusian, Romani, Moorish, and Jewish influences, a perfect metaphor for Spain's complex history of cultural mixing. It's the sound of an empire that, though diminished, left a blazing trail of artistic innovation behind. Walk through any Spanish city, and you'll be greeted by a visual buffet of architectural wonders, from the soaring spires of Gothic cathedrals to the intricate Moorish palaces like the Alhambra in Granada, which looks like the love child of a fairy tale and an Instagram influencer's dream. Spain's buildings are like history textbooks you can walk through. Fortresses that once kept invaders at bay now draw tourists snapping selfies. Baroque churches packed with gold from the New World gleam under the sun. Reminders of a time when Spain was flush with riches, before economic mismanagement made those gold piles look more like piles of IOUs. One of Spain's biggest legacies is language. Spanish, or Castilian, if you want to get technical, is now the second most spoken language in the world, with hundreds of millions of speakers across the Americas, Europe, and beyond. Thanks to Spain's colonial adventures, Spanish is the lingua franca, from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, meaning half the Western Hemisphere owes their telenovelas, spicy dishes, and passionate expressions to Spain's linguistic reach. So when someone complains about how tricky Spanish grammar is, just remind them, you're learning the language of conquistadors, poets, and siesta enthusiasts alike. On the literature front, Spain gifted the world Don Quixote, the first modern novel, and the ultimate story of dreaming big and tilting at windmills. Cervantes' masterpiece still inspires writers, filmmakers, and anyone who's ever felt a bit delusional about their life goals. Spanish cuisine might just be one of the tastiest parts of their legacy. Tapas, papaella, jamón ibérico, words that immediately make your mouth water and your stomach remind you that dinner is important. Spain's culinary traditions, rooted in history and regional pride, have influenced global food culture far beyond its borders. And of course, the wine, Tempranillo, Rioja, Cava. Spain's vineyards produce wines that can rival France or Italy, and some might say they do it with more flair and less pretension. If you ever find yourself sipping a Spanish wine, raise a glass to the empire that lost power, but never lost its taste. Spain's colonial footprint is impossible to ignore. From the sun-drenched plazas of Mexico City to the vibrant streets of Buenos Aires, the echoes of Spanish conquest and culture are everywhere. Half of South America speaks Spanish because of Spain's colonial past, which is both impressive and complicated. Spanish influence reshaped indigenous societies, languages, religions, and governments, sometimes violently and often contentiously. The legacy is a mix of cultural fusion and historical wounds, reminders that empires leave more than just gold coins behind. Spain's legacy isn't just glitter and fiestas, it's also about reckoning with a past filled with conquest, colonization, and the suffering that came with it. Modern Spain has had to grapple with this history, recognizing both the achievements and the costs of empire. There's a growing effort to honor indigenous voices, revisit historical narratives, and acknowledge the pain beneath the monuments and museums. It's a reminder that legacies aren't just what you leave behind, they're what you choose to learn from. Today, Spain is a vibrant democracy, a member of the European Union, and a cultural powerhouse. It's a place where history and modernity dance together, flamenco alongside football, ancient castles beside buzzing cities, tradition mixed with innovation. Spain might not rule the world anymore, but its influence is undeniable. You see it in the language millions speak, the art admired worldwide, the rhythms that make your feet tap, and yes, in the occasional siesta that reminds us all to slow down a bit. So here's the truth. Spain's empire may have faded faster than a cheap tan, but the leftovers, oh, they're everywhere, on your plate, in your vocabulary, and even in your Spotify playlists. And honestly, that's a legacy worth dancing about. Imagine standing on a windswept plain in Wiltshire, England, staring at a giant circle of enormous stones, some standing tall like ancient sentinels, others toppled but still massive enough to crush a small car. This, my friend, is Stonehenge, history's ultimate "what the heck" moment. For thousands of years, it has captivated curious minds and frustrated historians, archaeologists, and amateur time travelers alike. Its sheer scale and mystery have inspired everything from serious scholarly debates to conspiracy theories involving aliens. Yes, really. So what exactly is Stonehenge? At its core, it's a prehistoric monument consisting of large standing stones arranged in a circular pattern. But that simple description doesn't do justice to its complexity and the mind-boggling effort it took to build. Stonehenge sits on the Salisbury Plain, a windswept area with no natural stone sources nearby, which means those gigantic rocks didn't just magically appear, someone hauled them there. But exactly how and why is still a puzzle that has historians scratching their heads. Let's start with the basics. Stonehenge was constructed in phases over roughly 1,500 years, starting around 3000 BCE. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already ancient history by the time Stonehenge got going. It wasn't just a one-off project either. Early humans kept tinkering with it, adding stones, rearranging and building mounds around it. What's really mind-blowing is that all this happened without the luxury of cranes, trucks, or power tools. Instead, they relied on sheer muscle power, wooden sledges, ropes, and probably a lot of frustrated shouting. Honestly, moving stones that weigh up to 25 tons without modern machinery sounds like the ancient world's version of assembling IKEA furniture, but with way fewer instructions and way more chances of losing a finger. One funny but surprisingly accurate way to think about Stonehenge is that its stones arranged better than my Wi-Fi signal. Unlike your spotty internet connection, these stones have been standing mostly upright for over 5 millennia, aligned with a precision that still impresses astronomers and engineers alike. For example, certain stones align perfectly with the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice. So precise it's almost as if these ancient builders had a VIP pass to the cosmos. But here's the kicker. While they nailed the astronomical alignments, no one really knows how or why. Was it a giant calendar, a temple, a burial site, or maybe just an elaborate way to show off their stone-moving skills? This is where the real mystery kicks in. Who built Stonehenge? How on earth did they manage it? And why did they invest so much time and energy into this colossal stone puzzle? The truth is, despite centuries of research, we don't have clear answers. The builders were Neolithic people, ancestors of the British Isles' first farmers, but they left no written records, no blueprints, no diaries, no Instagram posts. This silence has turned Stonehenge into one of archaeology's greatest enigmas. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces and no picture on the box. What's even more fascinating is that Stonehenge wasn't built by a single generation or even a single tribe. It took over a millennium, with different groups contributing, modifying, and redefining the site. Imagine passing down a family recipe, but each generation adds a secret ingredient or rearranges the steps. Except this recipe involved moving giant stones across the countryside and precise astronomical measurements. That's commitment. Or obsession. Maybe a bit of both. Despite all the unknowns, Stonehenge continues to be a powerful symbol, not just of ancient engineering, but of human curiosity and the desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves. People today still flock to it during the summer solstice, hoping to catch a glimpse of those perfectly timed sunrises and to feel a connection to the mysterious builders who lived thousands of years before. Whether it was a sacred site, a social gathering place, or a prehistoric science project, Stonehenge challenges us to imagine the incredible capabilities of our ancestors without their modern tools and technology. So as you picture those massive stones standing silently on the Salisbury Plain, remember, Stonehenge is not just a pile of rocks, it's a testament to human ingenuity, mystery, and a whole lot of questions that still make us say, what the heck? If Stonehenge were a Netflix series, it would be a mystery thriller with a never-ending plot twist and a cast of characters ranging from ancient priests to extraterrestrial tourists. Since no ancient Stonehenge diary has ever been unearthed, despite many enthusiastic, and probably slightly desperate, digs, we're left with theories that range from the brilliantly plausible to the gloriously absurd. So buckle up as we tour some of the most popular ideas about what Stonehenge really was, and why it still has us scratching our heads 5,000 years later. First up, the classic, and perhaps most sensible explanation. Stonehenge as a religious temple. Back in the Neolithic era, humans were pretty serious about their rituals and worship. Many archaeologists believe Stonehenge was a sacred site where early Britons gathered to honor their gods, ancestors, or natural forces. It's like the ancient equivalent of your local church, mosque, or temple, but with a whole lot more rock and a lot fewer stained glass windows. The careful alignment of the stones with the sun's movements during solstices suggests that it could have been a place where people observed and celebrated seasonal changes, perhaps asking for good harvests or favorable weather. Imagine thousands of people gathering to watch the sun rise perfectly between two giant stones, a prehistoric sunrise yoga session with less stretching and more, ooh, what's that huge shadow? Then there's the astronomical calendar theory, which is honestly one of the coolest explanations. Some experts say Stonehenge was essentially an ancient observatory or calendar, designed to mark important solar and lunar events. Think of it as the world's first high-tech calendar. Before calendars were tiny apps on your phone that constantly remind you of your dentist appointment. The precise positioning of the stones allowed people to predict eclipses, solstices, and seasonal changes, which would have been critical for agricultural societies. No more guessing if winter was coming. The stones had your back. But if Stonehenge was a calendar, it was the most elaborate, slow-loading one ever, because you had to wait years to see the next big solar event. Patience was clearly a virtue, or maybe boredom was just a serious problem 5,000 years ago. Now let's take a stroll down to the more mystical end of the theory spectrum. The Druids. Popular culture loves to link Stonehenge with the Druids, the priestly class of the ancient Celts, famous for their long robes, mysterious ceremonies, and probably very dramatic facial hair. The problem? Stonehenge predates the Druids by more than 1,000 years, but that hasn't stopped the idea from sticking. Some say it was a Druid meeting spot, or a place for secret rituals, because nothing screams top-secret meeting like a circle of giant stones in the middle of nowhere. Modern Druid groups still hold ceremonies at Stonehenge today, adding a nice touch of continuity, or at least showing how good real estate near a historic site is for event planning. Then we get to the wildcard theory. Stonehenge as an alien landing pad. Yes, you read that right. There's a subset of enthusiasts who think Stonehenge wasn't built by humans at all, or at least not without some extraterrestrial help. The argument goes something like this. How could Neolithic humans move 25-ton stones over miles without trucks or cranes? Aliens must have helped. Sure, it sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie. But hey, who are we to judge? Even if aliens were involved, they probably needed a blueprint, a plan, and maybe a coffee break. It's not like they just zoomed down from space and did a quick stone rearrangement on a whim. The alien theory is fun to imagine, and it certainly explains the out-of-this-world precision, but it remains firmly in the realm of creative speculation or fan fiction. Speaking of speculation, some of the less mainstream theories are basically the ancient version of Guess What I Did This Weekend. For instance, one idea is that Stonehenge was a giant healing center, attracting people from far and wide who believed the stones had magical powers. Visitors might have made pilgrimages hoping for miraculous cures, turning Stonehenge into the world's first spa and wellness retreat, minus the cucumber water and soothing music, obviously. Another theory suggests it was a giant tribal memorial, built to honor the dead, with each stone representing a fallen warrior or a revered ancestor. It's touching, but also raises the question, how did they decide which stone got which name? Was there a prehistoric game of rock, paper, scissors? What makes all these theories so fascinating is how they reflect our own human need to understand and explain. When faced with something as monumental and mysterious as Stonehenge, we reach for stories that fit our worldview, whether that's religion, science, folklore, or outer space. The truth is probably a mix of some of these ideas, or maybe something we haven't even thought of yet. Stonehenge challenges us to think beyond simple answers and embrace the complexity of ancient human life. So while no one can say for sure who built Stonehenge, why they did it, or how they managed such an engineering feat, The variety of theories keeps the conversation alive, and let's be honest, if aliens ever do drop by for a visit, we might finally get the answer. Until then, Stonehenge remains the ultimate prehistoric Where's Waldo, except instead of a striped shirt, you're searching for a civilization's lost secrets carved in stone. If you thought your last trip to the hardware store was exhausting, imagine dragging giant stones weighing up to 25 tons without a truck, crane, or even a proper wheel. Welcome to Stonehenge, where ancient builders basically said, why rent a moving company when you have sheer muscle and relentless stubbornness? To truly appreciate this prehistoric puzzle, we need to talk about the stones themselves, the stars of the show, and their epic journey to the Salisbury Plain. Stonehenge's two main types of rocks are sarsen's and bluestones. Let's start with the sarsen's. These massive sandstone blocks are the big guys in the ring, the outer circle and the towering trilithons. Those two upright stones with a horizontal lintel on top. Each sarsen can weigh around 20 to 30 tons, which is roughly the weight of a small elephant, or your average SUV if it got really dense. These stones didn't just magically appear on the spot. They were sourced locally from the Marlborough Downs about 20 miles north of Stonehenge. That's still quite a trek if you're hauling multi-ton blocks without horses or trucks. Now the bluestones are the real showstoppers. These smaller but still hefty stones, usually weighing between 2 and 5 tons, actually travelled an impressive distance of about 150 miles from the Preseli Hills in Wales. That's like moving your furniture from one city to another without GPS, highways, or even a clear road. The bluestones are believed to have been transported by a combination of human effort and glacial movement during the Ice Age, but the exact method remains a point of heated debate among archaeologists. Picture a bunch of prehistoric movers trying to drag these stones across rivers, hills, and forests without so much as a dolly. So how did they actually move these stones? No one has found a secret ancient scroll titled Moving Big Rocks for Dummies, but scholars have pieced together some likely methods based on experiments, archaeological finds, and a bit of good old-fashioned guesswork. One popular idea is that they used wooden sledges or rollers, basically logs laid out like a prehistoric conveyor belt. Workers would pull the sledges, and the logs underneath would roll, allowing the stones to inch forward. This technique, while clever, must have taken an insane amount of manpower and coordination. Just imagine the grunts, the sweat, and the occasional, "Hey, can someone get a break here?" Waterways were probably used too. For parts of the journey, the stones may have been floated on rafts along rivers. This makes sense for the bluestones coming from Wales, since the landscape between the Preseli Hills and Salisbury is riddled with rivers and streams. The ancient equivalent of stone rafting likely helped ease the journey, but it still wasn't exactly a leisurely cruise. Navigating a giant rock on a rickety wooden raft through rapids. No thanks, I'll stick to the subway. Once the stones arrived at the site, the next challenge was raising them upright and balancing the lintels on top. Without cranes or modern machinery, the builders probably used a combination of earthen ramps, ropes, and a whole lot of teamwork. Archaeologists suggest they dug holes and tilted the stones into position using sheer force, levering them up bit by bit. It's the ultimate test of if, at first you don't succeed, try shoving a 20-ton rock some more. The precision required to fit the lintels on top of the uprights, especially with those mortise and tenon joints, basically ancient woodworking joints carved into stone, shows these builders were no amateurs. They had serious skill, patience, and probably a secret stash of ibuprofen. Humorously, it's worth noting that while today's movers complain about stairs and parking, the Stonehenge crew had to wrestle with these stones over uneven terrain, mud, and who knows what else. No fragile labels here. One misplaced shove could have meant disaster, but the builders pulled through, literally and figuratively. The feat is all the more impressive considering this was done over a span of centuries, probably with generations passing the torch or rock to the next. What about the motivation? Why go through such Herculean effort? Some say it was for religious or ceremonial reasons, while others argue it was a way to display power and unity among the people. Whatever the reason, hauling these stones was clearly more than just a DIY weekend project. It was a community effort that likely involved hundreds of people over decades. Imagine the prehistoric group chat. "Hey, don't forget tomorrow's stone hauling party at 6 a.m. Bring your mussels and snacks." In the end, the stones themselves have become symbols of human ingenuity, perseverance, and a little bit of stubborn madness. They remind us that our ancestors could accomplish incredible things without iPhones, power tools, or even wheels, at least, not as we know them. Stonehenge's stones have survived millennia, standing tall and proud, challenging us to unravel their secrets, while silently judging how we move our IKEA furniture with all the modern conveniences. Imagine trying to build a giant stone circle thousands of years ago, without smartphones, GPS, or even a basic calendar. Yet, Stonehenge manages to line up perfectly with the rising and setting sun during the summer and winter solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year. That's right. These stones have better schedule awareness than most of us, who can barely remember to set an alarm. The solstice alignment is probably the most famous and mind-boggling feature of Stonehenge. On the summer solstice, when the sun rises at its most northerly point on the horizon, the first rays shine directly into the heart of the monument, through the main entrance. It's like Stonehenge was designed as the ultimate prehistoric sunrise alarm clock, but one that no one ever snoozed. For thousands of years, people have gathered there to witness this magical moment, a reminder that even in the Bronze Age, humans were obsessed with marking time and understanding their place in the cosmos. But why is this so astonishing? Well, figuring out exact solar alignments requires serious observation over many years, decades even. Ancient builders had to watch the sun's path across the sky through all 4 seasons, memorizing the slow dance of shadows and light. Without telescopes or computers, they relied purely on patient, repeated observation. They noticed the points where the sun rose or set on particular days and designed the monument to reflect those points. It's a celestial feat that shows not only remarkable dedication but also advanced knowledge of astronomy, long before modern science was even a twinkle in Galileo's eye. And the alignment doesn't stop at the summer solstice. Stonehenge also aligns with the winter solstice sunset, where the sun dips below the horizon between 2 of the massive stones, creating a spectacular sight that likely held deep spiritual or ritual significance. The winter solstice marks the darkest day of the year, a turning point when days slowly start to get longer again. For ancient people living close to the land and seasons, understanding this cycle was essential for agriculture, hunting, and survival. Stonehenge may have acted like a giant calendar or even a sacred observatory, helping people predict the changing seasons and plan their activities. Beyond the sun, Stonehenge is believed to align with lunar events too. Some researchers argue that the monument's layout matches the moon's 18.6-year cycle, pointing to complex knowledge of lunar standstills when the moon reaches its northernmost and southernmost points on the horizon. Tracking such a long cycle takes generations of careful observation and record keeping. No easy task in the Bronze Age. If true, this suggests the builders were not just stargazers but sophisticated astronomers who could harness the sky's rhythms to guide their lives. Of course, all this celestial choreography has led to plenty of wild speculation. Some theories propose that Stonehenge was an ancient astrology hub, or a place for ritual ceremonies connected to cosmic forces. Others suggest it was a place where priests or shamans interpreted the heavens to communicate with gods or ancestors. Whatever the exact purpose, the astronomical alignments give Stonehenge a timeless magic that continues to captivate us. What's truly hilarious is thinking about how these giant stones outsmart us today in one crucial way: punctuality. How many times have you missed a meeting or forgotten an important date? Stonehenge doesn't. For thousands of years it has silently kept perfect track of the sun's grand performance, a reminder that sometimes the oldest methods are the most reliable. It's like the ultimate reminder that our ancestors, without calendars or clocks, were still the original timekeepers. And speaking of timing, the precision needed to achieve these alignments is staggering. The builders had to carefully place each stone, not just randomly or artistically, but with exacting measurements so the sun's rays would hit the stones on specific days of the year. Archaeologists estimate the angles and positions had to be within a few degrees of accuracy. No small feat when you're working with stones that weigh as much as a small car, dragged across the countryside, and then erected into towering monuments. This celestial mastery wasn't unique to Stonehenge either. Around the world, ancient cultures built monuments aligned with the sun, moon, and stars. The Mayan pyramids, Egyptian temples, and the Inca sun temples all share this trait. But Stonehenge's enduring mystery and rugged beauty make it a standout. It's a testament to human curiosity and the drive to connect earth and sky, the physical and the spiritual. So next time you complain about struggling to read a clock or figure out daylight savings time, just remember Stonehenge. Those ancient stones have been marking the passage of time with unerring accuracy for nearly 5,000 years. Without batteries, apps, or even electricity, they're the original celestial geeks, quietly watching over the seasons and reminding us that sometimes, to understand time, you just have to look up and maybe build a giant stone circle to celebrate it. When you look at Stonehenge today, towering and mysterious against the English skyline, it's tempting to picture a team of ancient architects with blueprints, hard hats, and maybe a caveman foreman shouting, "Okay everyone, 5 stones to the left, and let's keep it symmetrical." But the truth is, we don't really know who built it. Archaeology, legend, and wild imagination all swirl together into a story that's part fart, part mystery, and a whole lot of wait, what? The oldest and most solid evidence points to Neolithic people, our prehistoric ancestors who lived around 3000 to 2000 BCE. These were not cavemen grunting at each other, but skilled communities who farmed, hunted, and clearly had a knack for moving massive stones around. Archaeological digs show that these early Britons had the tools and social organization to pull off impressive feats of engineering, even without cranes, trucks, or YouTube tutorials. But here's where it gets tricky. Stonehenge was built in stages, over hundreds of years, so it likely involved multiple groups or generations of people. No single tribe or culture stamped their name on the stones, leaving historians to piece together the story from artifacts, burial sites, and carbon dating. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when half the pieces are missing, and the picture on the box has been smudged beyond recognition. Enter the Druids, those enigmatic, priestly figures from Celtic culture, often credited with magical powers and deep wisdom about nature and the cosmos. For a long time, popular imagination, fueled by 18th and 19th century writers, cast Druids as the masterminds behind Stonehenge. After all, it's a mystical, circular stone site, perfect for moonlit rituals and chanting. However, there's a catch. Stonehenge predates the Druids by at least 1,000 years, so while Druids may have used or revered the site later, they almost certainly didn't build it. This confusion is a great example of how history and myth get tangled together like spaghetti on a fork. When you don't have a clear answer, stories fill the gaps. Over centuries, legends piled on, tales of Merlin, the wizard, magically conjuring the stones from Ireland, or even the idea that giants moved them with superhuman strength. These myths are colourful and fun, but not exactly history class material. Archaeological discoveries have given us more grounded clues. Tools found near the site suggest the builders used stone and bone implements, wooden sledges, and ropes made from natural fibers to haul the stones. Excavations of nearby settlements reveal that the people were skilled farmers who lived in organized communities, with enough manpower to plan and execute such a massive project. The discovery of burial mounds and human remains around Stonehenge also hints at its possible use as a sacred place for ceremonies, honoring the dead, or connecting with ancestors. DNA analysis of remains from the area shows that these communities were not isolated tribes, but part of a wider network of people who migrated and traded across prehistoric Europe. So Stonehenge might have been a shared cultural project, symbolizing unity or collective spirituality among groups spread across the landscape. It wasn't just a local DIY project, but perhaps an ancient monument with regional or even international significance. Still, despite all this evidence, the builders left no instruction manual or signed contract, no carved "who built this" note hidden under a stone. Modern historians and archaeologists are basically playing an enormous guessing game, trying to match clues from tools, bones, and earthworks to understand the people behind this colossal endeavor. What's really fascinating is the level of social cooperation Stonehenge implies. Moving and erecting stones weighing up to 25 tons requires a huge workforce, good planning, and strong leadership. This wasn't a group of isolated hunter-gatherers. It was an organized society with the social complexity to manage labor, resources, and probably religious or cultural motivations. The fact that they pulled it off without modern technology is a testament to human ingenuity and stubbornness. Imagine the conversations. "No, I don't care if your back hurts, Harold. That stone isn't moving itself today." And the mystery deepens when you consider the purpose of Stonehenge for these builders. Was it a temple, an astronomical observatory, a burial ground, a place for healing, or all of the above? Since we can't ask them directly, the answer remains locked inside those ancient stones. All in all, the story of Stonehenge's builders is a blend of science, legend, and pure imagination. We have a rough sketch of who they were, farmers and early engineers, with serious muscle and vision. But many details remain as foggy as a British morning. What's clear is that Stonehenge wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a massive, meaningful project for a people who lived long before us, whose lives were intertwined with the rhythms of nature and the mysteries of the universe. So next time you visit Stonehenge, remember, those stones aren't just prehistoric Instagram props. They're silent witnesses to an ancient puzzle built by hands we can only guess at, crafted by a community united by something greater than themselves. And despite all our modern technology, the question, who built Stonehenge, remains one of history's greatest cliffhangers. Stonehenge isn't just a bunch of giant rocks standing awkwardly in a field. It's surrounded by a whole landscape full of secrets, especially when it comes to what our ancestors did there. Spoiler alert, it probably wasn't the prehistoric version of a backyard BBQ or a casual hangout spot where they grilled mammoth ribs and swapped gossip. Nope, Stonehenge was way more serious. Think sacred ceremonies, mysterious burials, and rituals that might make you shiver just hearing about them. Archaeologists have uncovered plenty of evidence showing that Stonehenge was part of a much bigger spiritual complex. The huge circular ditch and banks around it, called a henge, so original, right, aren't just decorative, they mark a boundary between the everyday world and a special sacred space. Imagine it as the ancient equivalent of a VIP-only lounge, but for rituals that probably involve chanting, dancing, and maybe some really intense staring contests with the stones. One of the biggest clues about Stonehenge's importance comes from the human remains found nearby. Excavations in the surrounding area have revealed burial mounds, cremated bones, and grave goods dating back thousands of years. This tells us that Stonehenge wasn't just a meeting spot. It was likely a place to honor the dead and connect with the afterlife. Think less picnic, more a solemn send-off. Although probably with fewer speeches and more mysterious ceremonies nobody quite understands today. The bones found near Stonehenge show signs of cremation, which was a common practice at the time. People didn't just toss their loved ones into a hole, they prepared them carefully for the journey to whatever came next. Whether that was heaven, Valhalla, or just another realm of prehistoric peace. Some of these remains were placed in or around the stones, suggesting that the monument was part shrine, part graveyard, part ancient, keep the family close zone. Interestingly, the burials don't just belong to a handful of important people. The site seems to have been a burial ground for a community or a tribe, indicating Stonehenge's role as a gathering place for rituals that united different groups. This supports the idea that it wasn't just a local landmark, but a cultural and religious hub for the wider region. If Stonehenge had a Facebook page, it would definitely have an events section with annual ancestor honoring ceremony marked as the main attraction. Now, about those rituals, archaeologists and historians have pieced together some theories based on ancient artifacts and the layout of the site. Some think Stonehenge was used for ceremonies linked to the changing seasons, like solstices and equinoxes. These were crucial times for agricultural societies because they marked planting and harvesting periods. So rituals probably involved prayers or celebrations to ensure a good crop. But don't imagine rustic farmers with pitchforks partying all night. These were serious symbolic events, maybe involving costumes, music made from bones or wood, and gatherings that brought the whole community together in a spiritual trance. Another possibility is that Stonehenge was used for healing rituals. Some ancient bones found near the site show signs of illness or injury, and there's speculation that people travelled there hoping the site's special powers could cure them. It was like an ancient wellness retreat, but without juice cleanses or yoga mats, just massive stones and a lot of hope. There are also spooky stories attached to Stonehenge. Some legends claim the site was built by giants or magicians, which adds an eerie, mythical flavour to the whole thing. Whether these stories were created to explain the unexplainable or just to entertain kids around ancient campfires, they show how Stonehenge captured the imagination of people throughout history and continues to do so today. What's clear is that the builders and users of Stonehenge saw it as a place charged with meaning, mystery, and power. The whole area was more than just a monument. It was a sacred landscape where the living connected with the dead, where the sun and moon guided human life, and where the mysteries of existence were celebrated and maybe even feared. So next time you picture Stonehenge, ditch the image of tourists taking selfies and imagine instead a place buzzing with spiritual energy, where ancient people gathered in ritual, wrapped in the chill of dawn or dusk, looking to the skies and the stones for answers. It might not have been your average hangout, but it was their spiritual headquarters, part church, part graveyard, part cosmic calendar. And hey, if you ever visit, maybe think twice before cracking a joke about it being just a big rock party. Because beneath the moss and weathered stones lies thousands of years of bone-chilling stories and sacred moments that still echo in the silence. Stonehenge wasn't always the world-famous icon it is today. After those ancient Neolithic folks finished stacking their massive rocks, the monument's story became a bit like a celebrity who drops off the radar for centuries before making a dramatic comeback. Let's dive into the saga of Stonehenge's life, after its builders packed up their chisels and left, tracing how it went from mysterious ruins to a must-see global landmark, with a few wild detours along the way. Right after its construction, Stonehenge remained a significant site for the local people, but as time marched on, societies changed and new civilizations rose and fell. By the time the Romans arrived in Britain around 43 AD, Stonehenge was already ancient, roughly 1,500 years old. The Romans were famously curious cataloguers, and a few of their historians mentioned Stonehenge, marveling at the sheer size of the stones and the mystery of who had hauled them there. They even speculated that Druids, Celtic priests, might have used the site for rituals, a theory that would stick around for centuries. But to the Romans, Stonehenge was more of a historical curiosity than a sacred site, something like an ancient ruin you'd visit on holiday to say, "Look at that giant rock circle." After the Romans pulled out, Britain entered the medieval era, and Stonehenge's reputation shifted from archaeological wonder to the stuff of legend and folklore. This was the age when stories ran wild. One popular medieval myth credited the wizard Merlin, yes, the same guy from King Arthur stories, with magically transporting the stones from Ireland. According to this tale, giants had originally built Stonehenge on the Emerald Isle, and Merlin, ever the helpful magician, decided to relocate the stones to Salisbury Plain. You have to admit, that's a pretty creative explanation for moving multi-ton rocks without cranes or trucks. Just a touch of medieval wizardry. During the Middle Ages, Stonehenge was often ignored or even feared. Local peasants sometimes saw the site as a place of magic and mystery, maybe even danger. Superstitions grew, and the stones acquired a reputation for curses or supernatural happenings, kind of like the ancient version of a haunted house. No one was quite sure what to make of it, so it became a place you respected from a distance and whispered about on moonlit nights. By the 17th and 18th centuries, however, the Age of Enlightenment began to change how people viewed Stonehenge. Scholars and antiquarians started to study it seriously for the first time, treating it less like folklore and more like history. Writers like William Stukeley sketched the stones and tried to piece together their origins, launching the field of archaeology in Britain. Stukeley and his contemporaries were fascinated by Stonehenge's astronomical alignments and connections to ancient rituals, but they also let their imaginations run wild, mixing facts with fanciful ideas about druids and sun worship. Stonehenge's fame continued to grow throughout the 19th century, especially with the rise of Romanticism, a cultural movement that loved the mysterious, the ancient, and the sublime. Poets and artists made Stonehenge a symbol of Britain's mystical past, and it became a pilgrimage site for those interested in paganism, history, and the supernatural. Victorian tourists flocked to Salisbury Plain, eager to see the stones for themselves, take a few sketches, and maybe imagine they were stepping back into a forgotten world. The 20th century brought even more attention to Stonehenge, along with new challenges. As tourism increased, concerns grew about preserving the site. Visitors sometimes climbed on the stones, chipping away at the ancient rock or leaving graffiti. Cars and farms nearby threatened the landscape's integrity. In response, conservation efforts kicked into high gear. The government and heritage organizations established rules to protect Stonehenge, including fencing off the stones to prevent damage and managing the surrounding area, to keep it looking as close to its original setting as possible. Stonehenge also became a focal point for modern spiritual movements. Every year on the summer solstice, thousands of people, ranging from curious tourists to druids, pagans and New Age followers, gather to watch the sunrise align perfectly with the heel stone. These gatherings are part celebration, part spiritual pilgrimage, and part festival. The stones, silent witnesses to millennia of human history, continue to inspire awe, wonder, and sometimes questionable dance moves. Today, Stonehenge is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most recognizable prehistoric monuments on the planet. It draws over 1 million visitors annually, from history buffs to casual travelers, all eager to experience a piece of mystery that has survived countless centuries. Advances in technology, like laser scanning and ground-penetrating radar, have allowed archaeologists to uncover new secrets without disturbing the site, proving that even after thousands of years, Stonehenge still has stories to tell. But despite all this attention, Stonehenge retains its aura of mystery. Nobody really knows exactly why it was built, how the stones were moved with such precision, or what the original ceremonies looked like. Its enduring appeal lies in that very uncertainty. Stonehenge invites us to imagine, to question, and to marvel at human ingenuity, and the desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves. So from its ancient builders to Roman tourists, medieval legends, Victorian romantics, and modern-day pilgrims, Stonehenge's journey is a fascinating mix of fact, myth, and cultural reinvention. It's gone from a sacred site to a forgotten ruin, then to a subject of scholarly study and a global icon, all while keeping its secrets under wraps. Stonehenge isn't just a dusty old pile of rocks stuck in the middle of Salisbury Plain. Oh no, it's a cultural heavyweight that punches far above its prehistoric weight class. Even thousands of years after those giant stones were hauled into place, Stonehenge still manages to grab headlines, inspire art, and throw one heck of a party every year. Let's unpack how this ancient mystery keeps flexing its muscles in today's world, from mystical music festivals to Hollywood blockbusters, while archaeologists continue their treasure hunt for new secrets beneath the stones. First up, Stonehenge as a cultural superstar. You might not realize it, but this prehistoric monument has become a symbol that transcends time, popping up in everything from album covers to advertising campaigns. For centuries, artists have been captivated by Stonehenge's iconic silhouette. Those giant lintels balanced like cosmic Lego bricks have a hypnotic appeal. Modern photographers, painters, and filmmakers use Stonehenge's image to evoke mystery, history, and a connection to something ancient and timeless. Whether it's a brooding music video or a mystical scene in a fantasy movie, the stones are a go-to symbol for all things enigmatic. Speaking of movies, Stonehenge has made quite a few silver screen appearances, from quirky comedies like This Is Spinal Tap, where the band's tiny Stonehenge stage prop famously falls short of epic, to more serious documentaries exploring ancient history. The stones have been a backdrop for storytelling and humor alike. The image of Stonehenge also often appears in sci-fi and fantasy genres, playing up those classic alien landing pad theories and supernatural vibes. It's like Hollywood's favorite prehistoric sidekick, forever shrouded in moonlight and mystery. But the real cultural heart of Stonehenge beats strongest during the annual summer solstice. Every June 21st, thousands of people, pagans, druids, spiritual seekers, and curious tourists gather at the monument to witness the sun rising perfectly in line with the heel stone. This isn't just a photo op, it's a celebration that links the present with the distant past. A kind of human chain stretching back thousands of years. People come to dance, drum, and share stories under the dawn sky, turning Stonehenge into one of the world's oldest and most enduring festival grounds. It's a wild mix of reverence, revelry, and a dash of hippie vibes that keeps the stones alive with energy. Outside the solstice celebrations, Stonehenge also influences modern festivals and music culture. Various concerts and gatherings inspired by the spirit of the place have popped up, using the mystique of the monument as a backdrop for creativity and community. While the stones themselves are protected and off-limits for most events, the cultural echo of Stonehenge resonates far beyond its stone circle, inspiring everything from electronic music festivals to art installations. Meanwhile, Stonehenge is far from a closed book for archaeologists. Thanks to cutting-edge technology like ground-penetrating radar, drones, and 3D laser scanning, researchers are uncovering more than ever about the landscape surrounding Stonehenge and the people who built it. These tools allow scientists to peer underground without turning a single stone, revealing ancient burial mounds, hidden ditches, and other monuments that hint at a much larger prehistoric complex. In fact, recent discoveries have shown that Stonehenge was part of a sprawling sacred landscape filled with other ritual sites and monuments, transforming our understanding from just a stone circle to ancient mega-spiritual theme park. Ongoing digs and research also continue to challenge old theories and spark new debates. Each year brings fresh hypotheses about Stonehenge's purpose. From it being a healing center, those blue stones were rumored to have magical properties, to an ancient social gathering spot where early Britons forged political alliances. What's exciting is that the mystery remains open. There's always something new to discover, and every answer seems to raise a dozen more questions. In a way, Stonehenge embodies the ultimate historical cliffhanger. Despite centuries of study, Stonehenge retains its enigmatic charm precisely because it refuses to give up all its secrets. For many, that's part of the magic. The idea that a monument built millennia ago still has the power to puzzle and inspire us today. It's a reminder that human history isn't just a straight line of facts, but a messy, fascinating web of stories, myths, and discoveries that evolve with time. So what's the final takeaway on Stonehenge today? It's a place where ancient mysteries meet modern culture, where science dances with legend, and where the past and present collide in a swirl of stones, stories, and solstice celebrations. Stonehenge stands as a symbol not just of what humans can build, but of what we can imagine and dream across the ages. And if you ever feel frustrated by how little we really know about it, just remember, Stonehenge is basically history's original buffering icon, still loading its secrets after thousands of years. While we may never fully unlock every mystery, that's what keeps Stonehenge eternally fascinating and endlessly fun to talk about.